What up guys, Otterpop here. South Park Season 8 reactions and reviews are here in one video for everybody to see, because it just makes it that much easier. So, all the reviews for South Park Season 8 are going to be posted right here in this video. You know, in this one single video, all of Season 8, all 14 episodes. 14? Yeah, pretty sure it's 14. And all the links to the reactions are going to be down in the description below. And don't worry, Seasons 9, 10, and 11 will be coming, I can promise you that. For Season 12, I've made it a mission. I will only release Season 12 reactions to the public if I reach 100 patrons on Patreon. And I don't remember how many I currently have, but it's not enough. It's not enough to reach that goal. So... and yeah, I know, it is what it is. So, that's the deal. So, go ahead and watch the rest of this video as you so please for all the review material. Or if you don't, if you just care about the reaction, that's fine. All of those links are going to be down below. So, go ahead and check every single one of those out. Go on, do it. Or just watch these reviews. Go ahead. I'll wait. What up guys, Otterpop here. You know what this video means. South Park is back. And of course I'm starting in a new format with this whole review and animatic style and whatever, but you know. But yes, South Park Season 8 is here and ready for watching. So as usual, go ahead and click on that link down in the description below, because then you'll actually get a chance to watch the reaction itself, whereas this is the review. Now, of course, those of you who have seen plenty of my reviews know that the review starts with a quick recap of the episode, but this time I'm going to be making the recaps as short as I possibly can. So a quick recap of the episode: the boys trick a vendor into selling them some martial arts weapons, then begin to have an anime-esque adventure of their own, complete with an art style change. But then they encounter Butters, and he gets injured, and the boys have to come up with a plan to get Butters treated, and not get caught by their parents in the process. Now, there are a whole bunch of other little things that happen in the episode, but that's just the basic gist of it. And first, I want to share my afterthoughts. I started watching this episode thinking that it would start off as any other South Park episode, but I was quickly surprised when this episode continuously switched back and forth between cartoony South Park style and awesome-looking anime style. I was not expecting the transition, and as quickly or as often as it happened, I just wasn't expecting it. But man, did it look cool. It reminded me of some like the old school anime. Not that I'd ever like supremely watched them, but I at least knew of them. Like, you know, Cowboy Bebop or Fist of the North Star or Dragon Ball. Like, it just had this awesome anime looking style whenever it transitioned to that. I just wasn't expecting something like this to appear in this episode, or any South Park episode for that matter. And despite the little amount of time that the team had, the art and animation department did a fantastic job of integrating this kind of style into the episode, even for just brief portions of it. And I'm a person who very much loves anime, from Full Metal Alchemist to Black Clover, Black Bullet to My Hero Academia, it doesn't matter. I love all different kinds of, especially fantasy anime, but it was really nice and such a pleasant surprise to see this kind of art style in this episode. And by the end of the episode, I'd reached a conclusion which I will reiterate here. This episode was the perfect representation of the experimentation, the nonsensical ridiculousness, and the dark-humored storytelling that South Park as a series is all about. I'll admit to being very tired at the start of the episode, but by the end of this episode, I was so happy. I don't think I've ever been happier coming out of a South Park episode, and not necessarily to say that this is my absolute favorite South Park episode thus far, like I can't just make that judgment automatically, but this was just such a beautiful blend of nonsense, humor, storytelling, and experimentation that I just haven't seen in too many episodes so far, even if many of them are good. But putting everything together, I think it was just the combination of all different kinds of factors is what made me just super tired to super happy and excited for the entire season. Most episodes that I've come to watch so far usually have some kind of lesson or point to make by the end of the episode, and I couldn't necessarily figure out what said point was by the end of the episode. But this is where the review and research really come in handy, because by the end of the episode, long story short, too long to explain, Cartman gets naked in front of a whole crowd of auctioneers, and Butters is still injured with the shuriken in his eye by the end of the episode. During a town meeting, the boys think that they're in trouble, but the townsfolk, it turns out, actually have a problem with Cartman getting naked and not Butters getting hurt by weapons. There's literally no way I would have known this, and please don't judge me for it, but a month prior to the episode being released, Janet Jackson during the 38th Super Bowl apparently had a wardrobe malfunction where her breast was briefly exposed. So Cartman saying wardrobe malfunction near the end of the episode was basically a reference to the incident that took place at said Super Bowl, and Stone and Parker basically intended to satirize the greater concern that public will have of nudity and sexuality rather than gore and violence, since, you know, the townsfolk cared more about Cartman being naked instead of Butters having an injured eye due to weapons and violence, and the boys being dumb. So I guess in a way that was the lesson, which kind of makes sense after rewatching the episode, or at least my reaction to it. Town meeting is done, boys apparently aren't in trouble, and I think for the third time by that point in the episode, this fiery beat comes crashing into my ears, and when I say crashing, I don't necessarily mean that it's bad. But this hype song just comes into focus, and I was visibly dancing numerous times throughout the episode whenever the song came on. According to my research, this is a song called Let's Fighting Love, and my guess is that it's a parody of J-pop which is featured in anime and kind of just in general, Japanese music industry. Especially songs with a combination of Japanese and English lyrics, which there are many that I do know of. There are many of these types of songs that I'm aware of, and I actually do know the words to a fair bunch. I know the words to all different kinds of Japanese songs. Many of them are mostly Japanese with some English lyrics, some of them are only Japanese. Heck, I even know a song with Japanese with just the tiniest bits of English, Latin, and German, and I wish I was kidding. But again, just tiniest bits, but still, I'm not kidding. I was completely taken aback and completely, at the same time, amused to find out that it was Trey Parker who performed the song, and is himself a Japanophile, so, he loves the Japanese culture and the people and the history. That doesn't necessarily mean he's an anime lover, but he probably could be a fan, I could see that. But seriously, props to the whole team, Stone and Parker included, for putting so much time and effort into this one episode, even though, it was all put together relatively quickly, like plenty of other South Park episodes, but especially for the art and animation department. They had to completely change their style for a number of scenes to this intricate, eccentric, and detailed anime-like style for so many of the scenes. Like, huge props to them for that. That's seriously impressive. And this actually seemed like a good time for them to release this episode with, the anime ideas and the satire and the parodies. Anime had been around in America since the 1960s, but as I suspected, based on my research anyways, it really kicked up a couple of gears in the 1990s, and by the mid-2000s, around when this episode came out, because I think it was released around 2004 if I'm recalling correctly, anime was much more widely accepted in America and was, in a way, spiraling upwards. Granted, I'm sure it was a great episode and it was fairly well received when it initially came out, but I can't imagine what that kind of episode would do nowadays, especially since anime is so much more popular than it was back in that day. And the boys treated it like an anime-esque adventure throughout most of the episode. Despite having weapons, the boys are content to use them mostly for display and instead pretend to have supernatural and energy-based abilities like they're from Street Fighter or something akin to that. I mean, granted, I get it. I certainly create a lot of stories where characters will use weapons or superpowers, but more often than not, it's like some kind of superpowers, whether they're supernatural, superhuman, energy-based, that kind of thing. The boys pretend to have a bunch of supernatural powers, but it seems like the weapons are almost sidelined a little bit in this episode. Even though the episode is called Good Times with Weapons, you think that the weapons would have a little bit more of a presence, though I suppose they had a little bit less of a presence once Butters got hurt by one. Speaking of Butters, I felt so bad for him throughout most of this episode. Initially, I was super happy to see his character again, and especially to see Professor Chaos and him sort of taking charge and taking it a step up, but then he got injured by Kenny Shuriken, and everything just went downhill for him. The boys refused to take him to a hospital and suggested the veterinarian and tried, dressing him up or, making a disguise to turn Butters into a dog or something like that, I don't know. And all the while he kept saying, I need to go to the hospital, guys. But it was just, The more often I see Butters, the more I see him as sort of an underrated gem in South Park, or maybe everybody loves him, but I just don't fully know that because I'm only a little bit into the series thus far. But he's such an underrated, innocent, naive, creative, underrated gem. A part of me wonders if he's ever gonna grow a spine eventually, but at the same time, if he did, he just wouldn't be the same character. And a show like this needs a character like Butters. As bad as we feel for him as often as we do, the show needs him to stay that way. I suppose for the time being, Professor Chaos and that character's personality, that alter ego's personality, is gonna have to be as close as it comes. Regardless, this was a fantastic start to a brand new season. Season 8 was apparently made during something called the Year from Hell, where creators Stone and Parker worked on Team America at the same time as this season, which caused writer's block amongst the staff. But based on the hype from other people that I've heard about from this particular season, maybe the staff could have been majorly successful despite these setbacks? I mean, if so, more credit is due to the staff and to Stone and Parker than I could have initially imagined. But I won't know for sure until I watch the rest of the season, so yeah, there's that. I'm really excited for the season, you guys. And based on what I've heard from other people, a lot of you are really excited too, so I cannot wait to watch the rest of this season, honestly. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this reaction as well as the review. Let me know how you guys feel about this new format. And before I finish this off, I want to quickly let you guys know about a Patreon that I recently started. I was a little bit hesitant to start one in the first place, but a lot of you suggested that I should, and some of you even said you'd support, so I've actually started one, and there's some actually really cool benefits to it. Newsletters, early access, commissions, sneak peeks, and so much more. And no matter what tier you pledge to, there are also patron shoutouts, so a huge thank you to my current and most recent patrons. Shout out to Jonah Fowle, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Slackety, and Stephen Watts. Thank you guys so much for the pledge, that really means a lot to me. I am hoping that with a little more Patreon support, I might even be able to release South Park episodes a lot more frequently, but only time can tell. I'll leave a link in the description below, so go ahead and follow that link if you want to know a little more. And of course, do not forget to check out Chloe Does Fandom Art and Moontoon in respective links below. These are the two individuals who have helped make my art for me, the thumbnails, the background images, the sprites. Seriously, these guys have some really cool art, so please do check it out. But that is all that I have for this reaction as well as the review, and in the future I'll try not to do as much advertising, and if I do, I'll try and make it super quick. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this review and the reaction, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here and welcome to another South Park review. This is going to be the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 2, Up the Down Steroid. Now before I get any further into this, you guys all know the drill. The link to the reaction is going to be down in the description below, but this is the actual review. So before I actually start that review, I want to apologize for the first review being as short as it was. That wasn't my intent. But this is also a brand new system that I'm testing out, and a brand new format that I'm testing out, so we're kind of just rolling with it. Phew, now that that's out of the way, a quick recap of the episode. Jimmy and Timmy are participating in the Special Olympics. Timmy's working hard. Of course he is, he's Timmy. But Jimmy ends up taking steroids for an advantage. And meanwhile, Cartman, after learning of a big cash prize for the winner, does research so he can disguise himself as a disabled kid and have his own advantage and blah blah blah. This was an episode for so many reasons. Well, technically two big reasons, but a bunch of sub-reasons, I guess you could say. Specifically, there are two characters I want to talk about. Jimmy and Cartman. But I'll save Cartman for later because I've got things to say about Cartman. Obviously, there are two major plot points that happen over the course of this episode. Again, like I said in the recap of the episode, there was Jimmy using steroids and Cartman pretending to pass off as a disabled kid to enter the Special Olympics and get a cash prize. But again, let's focus on Jimmy first. Now, steroid use is not necessarily a new thing. A lot of athletes have used it in the past to especially enhance their physical ability. Everybody knows this, but many sporting organizations saw this as a form of cheating, and most of them have banned it, if not all of them. I mean, I don't think all of them, but I'm pretty sure that most of them have. But enhanced physical ability isn't the only, for lack of a better term, side effect for steroid use. Steroid use is not uncommonly also known for having adverse effects on athletes. Organ damage, hypertension, behavioral changes, that sort of thing. I could tell that Jimmy was somewhat competitive with this, so I can kind of understand why he would even agree to take the steroids in the first place, but I knew immediately that Jimmy would spiral downward as soon as he took that first dose. My suspicions were confirmed when he berated Timmy after his friend discovered the steroids, and later when he beat up his girlfriend, and kind of accidentally his mother, and had a breakdown immediately afterwards. All of which I knew was because of the steroids, because I knew of the effects of those enhancers. I mean, did I know exactly what was going to happen? No, but I knew that something bad was going to happen, and it was worse than I could have thought. Of course, this is also pumping steroids into, what is he, like an 8-9-year-old boy, something like that, so yeah, I felt really bad for him over the course of the episode. But at least he admitted to his mistake at the end of the episode. I mean, first off, a lesson came from Jimmy of all people. That is freaking cool. But while he talks about steroid use, it occasionally pans to 3 baseball players who were at the Special Olympics to give out awards, and I immediately suspected that all 3 had used, or maybe allegedly used, or were connected to steroids somehow, and I eventually later learned I was correct. Funny enough, that little scene at the end where Jimmy gives his whole big speech on, steroid use and stuff like that, it also kind of mirrors what happened with Butter's father. I think it was a Butter's own episode. It was the last episode of a recent season when, Butter's father made a speech about, lying and confessions while the camera panned occasionally to O.J. Simpson and John and Patty Ramsey and one other individual, which I recognized when I initially reacted to that episode too. But at least Jimmy at the end of the episode admitted to the fact that he was wrong in using steroids, because steroids can have very negative consequences for athletes, in particular, and while they can enhance one's ability, hence while they're kind of banned at sporting events, they have many unintended consequences as well, both physiological and psychological. So hip hip hooray, Jimmy learned a lesson and he got to share it with everybody. Do you want to know who didn't learn his lesson though? Cartman. I just want to punch that little fat kid in the dick so many freaking times, and then the ass. Ugh! Apparently Stone and Parker had the idea to have Cartman join the Special Olympics as early as season 3, but it wasn't actually a solid idea that came to fruition until season 8. Funny enough though, there was a little bit of controversy that surrounded this episode. I mean, an individual pretending to be disabled so as to participate in the Special Olympics. It was also a plot to a movie that was released around the same time called The Ringer. It was something that Stone and Parker didn't even realize had happened until the actual production of the episode. But despite this, Stone and Parker didn't really see them as having ripped off the idea from the people who made The Ringer, and they didn't really see it the other way around either, because the way that they saw it, it wasn't really a difficult idea to come up with. I mean, an individual pretending to be disabled to participate in the Special Olympics, it's not that complicated. Heck, they didn't think it was a solid idea that could be turned into a 22-minute episode, let alone a 2-hour movie. Apparently, the production group that made The Ringer tried to turn it on Stone and Parker and claim that they stole the idea from them. If Stone and Parker say that they came up with the idea as early as season 3, then I'll take their word for it. They seem like trustworthy guys to me. Regardless, Cartman still managed to convince his mom to get him into the Special Olympics, and he assumed that he would have an advantage. But I was very satisfied to see that he most certainly did not. He came in utter last. Still, Cartman persevered. He tried to do his absolute best to win any event or even not get last place, but that clearly failed. Kyle even throughout the episode tried to convince Cartman not to do this nonsense, claiming that Cartman's actions were morally wrong and highly offensive, which is a perfect summation that I absolutely agreed with throughout the entirety of the episode. You know, I think I tried to explain it a little bit as I was reacting to this episode, but knowing me, I'm just not very good with my words, and even as I was thinking about what I just said and I couldn't even remember fully what I just said, there were still a whole bunch of points that I had made and I'm not even sure necessarily if I worded them correctly, so right here in this review I'm going to word it briefly and to the best of my ability without potentially offending anyone, because again, I know I can do that accidentally on occasion. While it's not directly stated, I feel like it can be implied, partially because this is Cartman's personality, but Cartman clearly views himself as superior and disabled kids as weak and or inferior in some way. And that in of itself is such a disadvantage for Cartman, at least in this case. The fact that Cartman came in dead last despite not being disabled or handicapped like everyone else in the tournament proves as much that disability does not inherently make somebody weak. And this is something that I know on a personal level. I mentioned it in my reaction. In 2nd grade, I was having some strange behavioral issues, so my parents ended up taking me to the school psychologist, who suggested that I had Asperger's syndrome, which is a mild form of autism. My parents were concerned because they knew that something like that could affect me for the rest of my life, so they took me to a professional psychologist, who instead told me that no, I didn't necessarily have Asperger's, but I was socially underdeveloped. And my parents started setting up a sort of regimen for me to get me more social. Girl Scouts, soccer, getting more active in, school activities. Looking back, I think my parents' intervention in my social life may have actually helped me, but only a little bit, because I still had social issues and social underdevelopments in a lot of ways. I thought of myself as socially retarded for a long time, in all honesty, and I'm not even joking about that. My conversational skills were subpar at best. I was so disconnected from people in general, even friends and family. I had no social awareness. I couldn't perceive emotion or gestures very well. I could barely process or comprehend humor and sarcasm, and I distinctly remember having various phases where I was obsessed, like seriously obsessed with certain scientific topics or history. My parents even confirmed it to me years later that I would obsessively talk about certain topics, and if somebody tried to veer that topic to something else, I would immediately try and change it back without any awareness of what anybody else was thinking or talking about. Not to mention the occasional mood changes that I would have that would just appear and disappear at random. And no, this has nothing to do with puberty. This was even in my elementary years. These were all issues that persisted in my elementary and middle school years and even into my high school years. Now, why necessarily do I say all this? I've certainly mentioned this kind of topic in the past, but only briefly. But there was a reason this time during this reaction and this review for me to talk a little bit more in depth about this particular topic. But this is also my personality. This is something that I've grown up with for a very long time now. It's something that still affects me even to this day. People might be shocked to see that what happens on camera isn't necessarily what happens in real life as well. I still have trouble conversing with people on a regular basis. I still get anxiety over being with people for long periods of time, even friends and family. But I've come to accept the fact that this is just an inherent weakness of mine. I'm pretty sure it's genetic and this is just my personality, and it's probably something that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. But despite that flaw, of being socially underdeveloped for so long and still having problems to this day, that flaw does not make me weak. I still have my strengths and my passions. I still have my creativity, and I still have a little bit of confidence, and I have respect, and I am incredibly responsible and hardworking. And that may seem like I'm being somewhat immodest, but this is what other people have said about me, and sometimes to me. Everybody has their strengths and their flaws, but it is our choice whether we identify ourselves by those strengths or by those flaws. From physical malformations or underdeveloped abnormalities, many disabilities can make it difficult to lead easy lives. But many people with these conditions can still thrive and can still fight back and prove that they are strong despite this. That is what Cartman doesn't understand. That's what Timmy proves, and that's a powerful message. In summation, the message that I took from this episode and that I want to share with you, the point I was trying to make in general for this review as well as the reaction, just because you have a weakness does not mean that you yourself are weak. I mean, I could be looking just a little bit too much in this episode, but for some reason, putting everything together, that's what I felt like was kind of supposed to be represented in this episode. Or, again, I could be looking too much into it, but you never know. This is a review after all. This is my interpretation of this episode, whether it was intended or not for that interpretation to be correct. Because it's an interpretation, for a reason. But yes, those were definitely the two big topics that deserved a mention, or at least a thorough talking about, for this episode. Jimmy's lesson and his message, and Cartman is a dick. I will say too, it actually is quite nice listening to the commentary for these seasons and episodes, because you get to hear straight from Stone and Parker's mouths, you know, some little details you never even thought about, or little details that we wouldn't have guessed because, you know, they were just personal ideas. Like, for example, the title references the Up the Down Staircase instead of Up the Down Steroid, which is a story that Parker performed in a high school play and hated. And apparently Stone even once pretended to be disabled to get into a Six Flags for half price. I mean, that was years ago, but still, that's kind of funny. I mean, maybe not too funny, but it is mildly funny, I guess. Now, I hope you guys aren't too bothered by me going super in-depth with this, but there was just a bunch that I really connected with, and there was a bunch that I wanted to talk about, and frankly a little bit to clarify as well, because again, I know I have a bad habit of wording things wrong. I think I apologized multiple times in the reaction, and I still apologize in case I did happen to word something wrong, but I hope that this clarifies it. But that is all that I have for this particular review, so thank you for sitting and listening, because I really appreciate the people who do listen to these reviews all the way through, or even just some of the way through. It does mean a lot to me. And please don't forget that I do have a Patreon now, and you can get a whole bunch of rewards, such as, you know, early access to some of these South Park reactions and reviews, so there's that. So go ahead and check out a link down in the description below. It should be a patreon.com/otterpopyt. Please, again, do check it out. The support would be amazing, and it would be cool to be able to post these episodes more frequently than just twice a week. And definitely don't forget about Chloe and Moon. I owe these two big thanks for helping to provide the art for the thumbnails, the backgrounds, the sprites, so go ahead and check out some other links in the description below, because seriously, they got some cool stuff. But that is all that I have for this review, so thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction and this review, and thank you very much for listening. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here, and welcome to another South Park review. This right here is going to be the review for Season 8, Episode 3, Passion of the Jew. Now, before I get onto the review and recap of the episode, don't forget to look in the description for links to the actual reaction, as well as a couple of other things, such as my Patreon, which I'm hoping to get a little more support for, but you absolutely do not have to, so don't worry about it, as well as to links to profiles of the artists who have helped me put together the things like the thumbnails and the sprites, and yeah. So do that. Now on for a quick recap of the episode. Strap in because there are 3 different plot lines happening here, albeit they're related. Another anti-Semitic remark from Cartman forces Kyle to see The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, a movie which horrifies him and shakes his faith. After Kyle tells him he's right, Cartman starts a cult in which his personality mimics Hitler's of World War II to praise Mel Gibson. Stan and Kenny also go to see the movie at some point, but find it horrible and bad. They try to go to Mel Gibson's house to reclaim their movie ticket money, but the director turns out to be an absolute whack job. Now, before I start discussing a variety of topics, I firstly want to praise myself for finally being able to see the general idea or general picture of what the episode was trying to convey, even not even halfway through the episode, so congrats to me. And with that, on to discussion topics. First and most obviously, the subject of the episode, the movie The Passion of the Christ. Now, I will admit to having not really heard of this movie. I'm not sure if it's because I just literally never heard of it, or maybe I'd heard of it years ago, but just kind of forgot about it until now. I was pretty young when this movie came out. I was probably about 8 years old, I think. But the movie was out shortly before this episode was aired. Stone and Parker were surprised by the box office numbers. I mean, they thought it was bad. They thought it sucked. It wasn't the best movie, but they did know a lot of people who loved it, or would hear it on the streets. This movie was also apparently mentioned in both previous Season 8 episodes, Good Times with Weapons and Up the Down Steroid, which I remember noticing, but I didn't really make note of because I didn't think it was all that important. But this is South Park, and I should know better. Regardless, just like in the episode, the movie in real life received some controversy. Some claimed it was a religious classic, while others deemed it anti-Semitic trash. Again, similar to what happened in the episode. Now, as I mentioned in the reaction, I am not religious and I didn't really know anything about this movie. Even if I did, I still would have been really young. But I suspected that the movie in real life was primarily a dramatization, or at the most only semi-accurate. But I was amazed to read about how this movie affected people strongly both in real life, again, just like in the episode. I may not be entirely familiar with this movie still, but I honestly have no inclination to watch it at any point. Controversy or popularity aside, religious themes aren't the easiest ones for me to understand. Not to mention, watching any kind of violence or torture just doesn't sit well with me, no matter the context, especially if it's super graphic. And now maybe on a little lighter of a note for this review, Mel Gibson, the director of the movie. Look, I may be uncultured, but even I knew who Mel Gibson was when I watched this. Now, I did read something a little bit interesting, something that I hadn't really considered while I was watching in the episode, but most of Gibson's movies involve physical torture, hence why he was constantly talking about torture in the episode. During their commentary of the episode, Stone and Parker read some of Gibson's comments on Holocaust posts and thought him an anti-Semitic weirdo. But despite that, they still considered him a genius since the entire movie was in Aramaic. They talked about how some lines might sound cheesy if they were in English, but you really can't make fun of or laugh at too much if you hear the same word said in another language, so they did consider Gibson a genius in that respect at least. And it was kind of something I noticed, but Gibson throughout the episode frequently said lines or took on appearances of characters of even some of his own movies, including Braveheart and Mad Max 2 Road Warrior. Now I know that there were some other movie references, but those were kind of the big ones that I noticed. Now, the movie and this episode came out in 2004, but in July of 2006, Gibson was arrested for a DUI, and where he also made some anti-Semitic remarks in a drunken stupor is my guess. And side note, this episode was re-aired shortly after. Now that we've talked about the cultural references of this episode, let's talk a little bit about the characters. Granted, all four boys had their own little adventures throughout this entire episode, but the two main characters that the episode seemed to focus on were Cartman and Kyle. God, Cartman had such an ego boost throughout the entirety of this episode, it really pissed me off. I said at the end of the reaction to this episode that we need a character like Kyle in such a big cast who's morally centric, which I guess means that the opposite also has to be true. Cartman is clearly a morally absent character, and it very much shows in this episode. After Kyle tells him that he's right, Cartman gains such an ego boost, for one thing. And you know, as soon as he dons that costume or outfit, whatever you want to call it, and changes his hair, I immediately recognized the parallels that were happening. And by that, I mean the parallels between Cartman and Hitler. Yes, Hitler. You know, if this was the first time that Cartman had done this, there would definitely be some shock value. But I'm pretty sure that this already happened in a first season episode, but it definitely happened once. The clothing and the hair make it obvious enough, but Cartman even later starts speaking German and talking in German phrases. I mean, I'm not sure how well he does it necessarily. He didn't do it great, but he didn't do it terribly either, I guess. Specifically though, I'm referring to 3 different German phrases, 2 of which he says and another of which he says and asks the crowds to repeat. The first of which he says is, Es ist Zeit für Säuberung, which basically translates to, it is time for cleansing or cleaning or purging. The second of which is Es ist Zeit für Rache, which basically translates to It is time for revenge. And the third of which is called out by the crowd, is Wir müssen die Juden ausrotten, which itself translates to We must exterminate the Jews. Naturally, the adults in South Park, and probably the adults in general in this world, just think it's Aramaic. They don't necessarily think it's German, and they don't even know what it means. And even if I wasn't able to translate all of it on my own, I knew better. Either Cartman could have already known the German and its translations, or he researched it at some point during this episode. Either way, he would have known that these were likely phrases used during World War II and the Holocaust, which means, in a way, he put himself on the same level as Hitler, the action itself which is arrogant, offensive, and egocentric. If anything, Cartman's ability to convince the masses goes hand in hand with the idea of blind faith that Hitler likely used in World War II himself, and the idea that in a way every religion, even my own beliefs, are based on blind faith in of itself. Now don't go rushing in to type hate comments, because when I say blind faith, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I can't necessarily speak for other religions, and I probably shouldn't go into detail about that, but even with my atheism, I don't necessarily believe in a god or a higher power, but there's no proof that a god doesn't exist, and so in a way I have blind faith that that is the truth that I abide by. And I'm willing to bet at least one other religion has some similar principles or ideas regarding blind faith. Now, it may not be seen often, and again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but blind faith does exist out there, whether it's for certain religions or ethnicities, again, just as Cartman proved as he was able to get the masses to follow him blindly. Seriously, they didn't know what he was saying. They didn't realize that he was actually saying German and not Aramaic. They just blindly assumed, and subsequently had blind faith in Cartman. I think I've spoken enough about Cartman and how much of a d-bag he was in this episode. But there is another character that should not go unmentioned, and that's Kyle. In a way, both Kyle and Cartman were the catalyst for everything else that happened in this episode. It was Cartman's anti-Semitic remarks that got Kyle to see the Passion of the Christ in general, and then got him to question his own faith and eventually bring the discussion even to other Jews, which in of itself kind of caused the final showdown, quote-unquote, between Cartman's cult and then the Jews, and then the whole, randomness of Mel Gibson showing up behind Stan and Kenny. Regardless, Kyle's faith was challenged throughout the entirety of this episode. After watching the movie, he should have known it would be a little dramatized, but Kyle's faith is still shaken. Having been a child myself, I think I can confidently state that children can often misinterpret meanings or information, so I guess I wasn't terribly surprised when Kyle's faith was shaken, but the beliefs of adults in the Jewish church were not. But in the end, Kyle's faith is restored when Stan declares that they should focus on the teachings left behind, and not just dwell on history. For all the trouble the movie had given Kyle, it was interesting that all Kyle needed was to see how crazy cuckoo Mel Gibson was in order for him to reclaim his faith at all. Like, that's it? I guess the best explanation I can give this is cartoon logic, and the show is very episodic in nature. So I guess I can't really fault the character or the episode for that, or the series in general. I don't want to go into too much more detail about religion in general, at least for this particular episode. It was kind of a hard topic to avoid, because come on. The title of the episode is Passion of the Jew, and it's basically a riff on the title of Passion of the Christ, so it was gonna come up. Please do try not to hold anything against me if I worded it weird. I'm known for doing that, and I apologize. And yes, I may be atheist, but I am open-minded. I just don't know a lot about religion in general, or at least specifics about some religions. As long as there's no need to dwell on anything, we're cool. Though, do not hesitate to correct me if I made a mistake on anything, or if I said something wrong that you feel I need to clarify a little bit. Please do. I need to know this stuff. Anyways, that is all that I have for this particular review and reactions, so thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed both these videos, or maybe just the reaction if you really only cared about that. Although, if you're hearing this, you probably at least listened through most, if not all, the reviews, so thank you very much for that. It does mean a lot to me that people do watch these reviews. Again, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoy these videos, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here. Here's another South Park review right for ya. This is going to be the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 4, You Got F'd in the A. Now as usual, there are a whole bunch of links down in the description below, so go ahead and check them out. Link to the reaction, link to some profiles for the artists who have been helping me with my thumbnails and my sprites and stuff like that, as well as links to a Patreon that I set up not too long ago, as well as my Discord server in which I am relatively active, so please do go ahead and check out any of those links, or go ahead and just check out the link to the reaction in the description below, since that's probably what most of you are here for. But maybe some of you are here for the review, and before I start with the recap, this review is probably going to be a little bit short. I thought the review for the first episode of Season 8 was short, but no, I guarantee that this one's probably going to be even shorter. But let's start off this review with a quick recap of the episode. A group of kids from Orange County, California arrive in South Park. Through dance, they own Stan and his friends, but only Stan has been taught how to serve them back. Now suddenly there's a dance-off between the Orange County kids and Stan, but first he needs to create a dance troupe with 4 other individuals. It's a random combination, and their only saving grace may be Butters, a renowned tap dancer with a dark history. As I started watching this episode, I initially thought that the Step Up franchise had something to do with the episode plot. Generally speaking, the plots of every single one of the 5 Step Up movies differs in a variety of ways, but it's all basically centered around dance showdowns. So naturally, I thought that that's where the idea for this episode came from. Yet, no, I was definitely wrong. The first Step Up movie wasn't released until 2006. The title of this episode, You Got Served, it's more than just a phrase of getting owned as it happened constantly throughout the episode. It's said over and over again because it was parroting a movie of the same title. Stone and Parker and one of their writers and his girlfriend went to a place called Magic Johnson Theaters to see a movie called You Got Served, and they all kind of agreed that it was the worst movie they'd ever seen, or at least one of the worst. The movie audience was pretty much all black according to them, and yet many of them were dancing along in the aisles and getting up in their seats, and despite it not being necessarily the greatest movie in Stone and Parker's eyes, seeing everybody dance around and having so much fun actually made it a pretty fun movie experience for them. And as far as I understand it, the plot of the movie is pretty similar to the episode. Stan isn't looking to start his own recording studio like in the movie, but a group of dancers must win a city dance contest against a group of tough street dancers, basically. And in other news, Stone apparently met a producer of You Got Served who said that he actually loved the spoof that the South Park team came up with. So that's pretty cool. Obviously, there are a bunch of references and parodies across the entirety of this episode. I think I counted at least a dozen, based on my research, but I'm not about to go over them all. If I was a little bit more familiar with the movie and a little bit more familiar with the parodies that it was making off the movie, I might have done so, but I don't really know anything about the movie, and frankly, I'm not sure if I'm about to watch it. But I at least think I covered the general gist, so there's that. On the bright side, we do see a bunch of random secondary characters that return in this episode. I mean, one of the goth kids ends up joining Stan's dance troupe, and so does a Raisins girl, which completely surprised me. I'm not really surprised by the dance move she was pulling off. She was twerking. Yeah, not surprised. But more importantly overall, we get to see a little bit more of Butters' ability as well as his history. I had no idea, and I never would have guessed that he was a tap dancer. Not to mention that he's apparently got a pretty dark history when it comes to tap dancing. I mean, he accidentally being the key word, killed a bunch of people during his last competition like 2 years ago. He even had to go to therapy. Still, it was pretty cool to learn a little bit more about Butters. Although, less cool to know that he's got such a dark past, or at least a dark point in his life. I mean, that's just sad. He accidentally killed people while dancing. I do hope we get to see a little bit more on his history at some point. You know, some decent points, and not some pretty low points like what happened in this particular episode. There are plenty of South Park episodes that parody or reference stuff, but man, was this episode chock full of music and movie and pop culture references and spoofs and parodies. Again, I'm not gonna go over all of them, that's just way too many to look at. But heck, even I can notice some things from time to time, like, you know, Lil' Kim being physically little, as her name might suggest, which is exactly the opposite. One of Butters' victims during his dance competition had been cut in half and he was trying to gather up his organs, similar to what a soldier was doing in Saving Private Ryan. And that seems like a random thing to remember, but I've seen that movie more than enough times. My family even has a joke that we call it Saving Ryan's Privates. Don't ask. Even the song parodies that would occasionally pop up in this episode, like, you know, there was a song that was similar to Lose Yourself by Eminem, and there's this other song that was in, like, the beginning of the episode where the Orange County crew was dancing to, that's supposed to be a parody of Shake That Ass Bitch, which I do know of the song. I don't really care for it, but I do know of it. I've got enough people in my family who will listen to stuff like that. Seriously, there are tons of pop culture references in this episode, but again, I am not about to explain them all because that is a lot, most of which I don't even get, so there's really no point in me talking about it if I don't even get it myself. At least I managed to cover a couple of them, right? Right? See, I told you guys that this was going to be a short review. Seriously, this is about half the length of some of the reviews I've done already. But hey, what can you do? Not every episode is going to allow me to go into super specific detail or relay personal events because this one just doesn't quite hit it for me. There are some episodes that do that, but that also, on the flip side, means that there are some episodes that just don't. Maybe the next episode will be better? Who knows? We'll just have to find out. Until then, thank you guys so much for watching this review, as well as checking out the links in the description below if you did, and I hope you enjoyed the reaction as well as this review, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here and welcome to the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 5, AWESOM-O. Now before I get too much into the review and the recap of this episode, don't forget about all the links in the description below. Obviously the link to the reaction will be down there, but there are also links to the artist profiles who have helped me out with the thumbnails and the sprites and whatnot, and do not forget about the link to the Discord server, which I do check in on from time to time, and also to my Patreon. Seriously guys, things from early access to traditional commissions, and from sneak peeks to shoutouts. Speaking of shoutouts, a big thanks to patrons Gigi, Slackety, Dima, Licks, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, I may end up pronouncing it wrong, and Popcorn for new and continued support. The support does mean a lot to me, so seriously, thank you guys so much. Anyways, now that that's all done and out of the way, onto the review, which starts with a quick recap of the episode. Oh boy, this was definitely an interesting one. Cartman dresses himself up as a robot called the AWESOM-O 4000 from Japan so we can learn Butter's darkest secrets. But it turns out Butters has actually got some dirt on Cartman instead. So now Cartman needs to find the tape while still pretending to be Butters' best robot friend. But soon he's got a movie studio and the US military falling for the charade as well. Long story. Obviously, the central aspect of this episode was the sort of quote-unquote relationship between Cartman and Butters. Since Butters first even appeared on the show, Cartman and Butters have had a very rough and rocky relationship, similar to what Cartman and Kyle have, but even more so because these two particular characters are some of the most apparent opposite combos in the entire South Park cast. We've all seen it by now. Cartman's messed with Butters on a number of occasions, especially due to Butters' naive and nice personality. You know, Jared is AIDS, Casa Bonita, but this seemed to be the first occasion in which Butters got revenge on Cartman. Sweet, sweet revenge. I'm sure plenty of people by now have heard the phrase opposites attract. Basically, it's the idea that two people of opposing personalities are attracted to each other in a sort of weird way. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Cartman and Butters are attracted to each other, that's not even close to being the case. But the phrase still holds when people of opposing personalities interact with each other, and that's probably what made this episode so entertaining. It literally just focused on Butters and Cartman, specifically how their personalities oppose one another, and although Butters didn't know it, it was still entertaining to watch the entire episode through the lens of Butters in a sense. Because if you think about it, we saw both aspects of these characters or their personalities or a combination of both that we don't normally see. For one thing, we got to see Cartman panic and have a little bit of fear instilled inside of him as he tried to locate the tape recording that Butters had recorded, but we also saw Butters being able to have fun with an individual for once since, for the most part, pretty much every one of the kids messes with him in some way or doesn't really view him as a true friend. But in this case, we did get to see Butters, in a sense, have a true friend for once, but only because Cartman had to still keep the secret because Butters had some collateral. Speaking of Butters even having any collateral in the first place, I debated as to whether or not Butters creating the Professor Chaos persona had anything to do with his willingness to finally get back at Cartman, or if it just would have happened eventually given how often Cartman bullies Butters even in minor cases. I mean, come on, just think about it. Butters didn't even come up with ideas of schemes or plans or revenge until after he created his Professor Chaos persona. I mean, to me it just makes a little bit of sense, but you know, that's just me. Still, it is an interesting thought when you think about it. I also speculated as to whether or not Butters was actually unaware of Cartman's foolery. I saw it as the most likely explanation, or if Butters did know that Cartman was AWESOM-O and he was pretending as well so as to punish Cartman. I personally thought that that would be an awesome twist to his character, but I saw it as less likely, especially this early on in the show. Maybe in a later episode I could see something like that as a bit more likely than what actually happened in the episode, but this early on, probably not. Too bad, that would have been awesome. That would have been a great plot twist. Which brings me to another cool point that this was definitely a Butters-centric episode. Sure, it decided to put Butters and Cartman into the same episode, and, you know, completely opposing personalities, opposites attract, and sounds like a fascinating concept, whatever. But it was Butters-centric. And frankly, it was probably needed. After the debacle of the previous episode, You Got F'd in the A, it was nice to see Butters in a really happy spot, even if it was pretend on Cartman's part. Not to mention, I quickly learned that Butters' birthday is on September 11th, so he's had misfortune following him since his birthday. That's a rough birthday to have, I gotta say. Well, and it's not like he was necessarily born on that day. He was technically probably born before that show ever came into existence, or actually there's no really solid time frame because it keeps referencing actual events. The show keeps referencing actual events, I mean, and yet nobody seems to age. I don't think he was born on that day. Either way, that's a rough birthday to have. Plain and simple. Can barely find a real friend, and he's got a crabby birthday. Which, hey, given the interactions he has with most of the other South Park kids, it's no surprise he doesn't have any real friends. And in this particular case, I'm not really calling out his character, rather I'm calling out the interactions the other kids have with him. Kids can be jerks, everybody knows it. Most kids don't usually like other kids that are the goody two-shoes, or the teacher's pets. Having been a little bit of a teacher's pet back in my day, I can kind of confirm this. But at the same point, he also makes himself an easy target for them, so I can't fully blame the other kids, but I'll still blame them anyways. The arseholes of kids in South Park clearly don't mind making fun of his innocence, his naivety, and his overly nice personality, but even so, he still finds a lot of the kids to be his friends even if they don't see him the same way. But throughout the episode, Butters hanging out more with AWESOM-O and subsequent parental conversations suggests more that Butters doesn't intimately interact with any of the kids his age more than anything else, which, given his personality and the personalities of the other kids, kind of makes sense. You know, given his poor track record of relationships and friendships, I'd love to at one point see Butters in a happy relationship with at least one of the South Park kids, whether current or new. Even the tiniest bits of progress in this series are welcome sights. Heck, I'd be willing to go so far as to say that Butters technically had some character growth in this episode. He finally took initiative in order to get revenge on Cartman because he was sick of Cartman bullying him and pushing him around all the time. Not to mention him recognizing at all that Cartman had even been bullying and pushing him around all the time up to this point. Regardless of how anybody else would define it, I still think that there could be a little bit of character development. And for various reasons that I've already talked about a little bit throughout this review, this is probably going to be one of my favorite episodes of the season. I'm not entirely sure yet, but we shall see what happens. And I don't think I'm the only one. I'm sure a lot of people were really happy to see my reaction to this. And not only that, apparently Stone and Parker thought this to be a favorite episode of theirs as well. Apparently the idea for this episode came from thinking about Cartman saying lame in a robotic voice, something which occurred multiple times throughout this episode. Honestly though, Cartman saying anything in this episode in a robotic voice was quite amusing to listen to. And hey, I'm still not a pop culture amateur. Well, actually sometimes I am. But as soon as I saw Catamount Studios, I knew immediately it was a reference to Paramount Studios. I didn't however realize that Paramount Studios is owned by Viacom, which itself owns Comedy Central, so hey, fun little nods and winks here and there. There were plenty of movie parodies and references, especially in Catamount, but there were just way too many. Plenty of which I either didn't catch or was unfamiliar with. Still pop culture amateur, don't judge. At least I'm not a total amateur. I once again speculated another movie that created some of the episode ideas, that being I, Robot. I was still incorrect, me being a pop culture amateur. But I was relatively close. I, Robot came to theaters in July 2004, but the South Park episode was released in April of the same year, so I was close, at least. I'm not that much of a rank amateur. Seriously though, I know recognizing pop culture in certain events is going to be a major downfall for me throughout this entire series, since that's what a lot of the episodes tend to revolve around. But at least I'm sort of getting better at recognizing some elements or riffs and nods and whatnot. Again, don't forget that by the time that some of these episodes were released, I wasn't even 9 years old, so you can't blame me for shite. Anyways, that's enough whining for me, and enough reviewing, since this is the end of the review this particular episode. But I had a lot of fun with this, especially looking at the characters of Butters, Cartman, and the relationship between them, or more specifically the interaction between them, since they're polar opposites. I'm sure most of you won't have listened to this review, but I'm sure that you'll have enjoyed the reaction, or maybe you've enjoyed this review if you have ended up listening this far. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you for checking out the reaction and any of the other links that are in the description below. So thank you all for watching, I hope you guys enjoyed these videos, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here and welcome to another review. This is going to be the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 6, The Jeffersons. Now before I get into the recap, if you're looking for the reaction and not the review, just follow that first link in the description below. In the description are also a couple of links for the Discord server, which I'm occasionally on, my Patreon, which I always appreciate more support on, and of course links to the artist profiles who have helped me out with these videos, especially the reviews. So seriously, go ahead and check some of those out, I would really appreciate it. Anyways, on to a review of the episode, which starts off with a recap, as you all probably know if you're familiar enough with these reviews. South Park has a new neighbor/resident, and it's Michael Jackson with a new identity, but he seems more interested in acting like a kid and playing with other kids rather than taking care of his own young son. Unsurprisingly, the guy is loaded, and Cartman kinda likes the guy because of it, but the others, not so much. They're more worried about the son, Blanket. Dumb but a jokingly sad name, by the way. The police are also trying to frame Mr. Jefferson with crime after learning he's black, but they have trouble doing so when they find out that he's white. Basically, a lot is happening in this episode. I can't can't remember times exactly, but this has probably been my longest reaction, or one of the longest reactions of South Park to date. And there's kind of no surprise as to why. There was a lot to talk about in this episode. Well, technically two big things. That being Michael Jackson, and the whole issue of the correlation between race and crime. Let's start off with the obvious elephant in the room, Michael Jackson. The point of the episode was basically using Blanket to point out that Jackson was a freak. Which, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I said it in the reaction, I'll say it again now. I've never liked Michael Jackson, never cared for his music, and definitely never cared for him as a person. Whether the allegations were true or not, whether there was enough evidence, I don't care. I never really liked the guy. And even besides that, he was just a weirdo. Stone and Parker even thought as much as well when they were talking about him in their commentary for the season. They researched a lot of things about Jackson and actually had a little bit of a difficult time exaggerating anything with Michael Jackson. His mannerisms, his speech, etc. You know, the hee and the whole ignorance, 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 you know, that kind of thing. Like I also said in the reaction, cultural and celebrity stuff I'm not terribly familiar with. But this particular individual, I actually did have a little bit of familiarity with. And you can hear me talk about it in the reaction a little bit. Some of the jokes and nods and references and riffs, I was thinking to myself, I definitely know that reference. Or at least I think I know that reference. I was doing it multiple times in the episode when it related to Jackson. Again, I was a little bit messy on some of the dates, but I got the general gist of it. The first allegations of any child molestation or sexual abuse on Jackson were actually made by a 13-year-old boy around the mid-90s. But due to lack of evidence, Jackson was never charged criminally, but he did settle with the family. Money. Lots of money. The second bout of allegations came around the early 2000s, so a few years before South Park released the episode. At one point in the episode, Jefferson ends up having a sleepover with some of the boys, which was a reference to the second allegations where Jackson claimed that there was no problem with sleepovers with minors. There was also another point in the episode where police were placing evidence in Jefferson's house, such as pubic hair on a toilet, which I'm not really sure if that referenced the first bout of allegations or the second bout, but I'm pretty sure it did reference one of those two. Again, not entirely sure on the specifics, but even I could spot those references from a mile away. There was a bit of another reference that I picked up on as well. Around the mid-80s, Jackson was actually diagnosed with vitiligo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm pretty sure I kind of am. But basically it's a condition where patches of the skin lose their pigment. Basically, some parts of his skin were very dark and other parts were very light. He ended up having multiple cosmetic surgeries. He may have under-exaggerated the number of surgeries he had, but he also used fair-skinned makeup to remedy this situation. But some suspected he was addicted to these kinds of decisions and treatments, and many people speculated and made fun of this. But I'm pretty sure that right there is the general basis of the reference later on in the episode, or near the end of the episode I think it was, where Jackson's skin is falling off all over the place and he says he wants to look younger. I'm pretty sure that that's kind of what that's referencing, or at least parroting. But holy crap, did I finally get a date right. I guessed that he had passed away in 2008 or 2009, but I wasn't entirely sure, and I turned out to be absolutely correct. He did pass away in 2009. And I was also correct in assuming that the news of his death spread quickly. I completely forgot that the memorial service was streamed, but I'm not surprised that it was watched by a lot of people. While I didn't state it in the reaction, I was slightly off with his death. He did die of cardiac arrest, but it was caused by a propofol overdose. Propofol is kind of an anesthetic, by the way. But it does make sense, the reference in the episode of when the police were planting cocaine in his house at some point, since he did technically die from a drug overdose and was known to use other medications. Either way, it was so obvious that this episode existed for nothing more than to make fun of Michael Jackson. But I also stated in the reaction as well, he's definitely had his faults. I don't particularly like him, but despite all this, he was still a major pop culture icon. He was honored by multiple US presidents. He had Grammy nominations and wins. He was successful in the music industry with influence and money from his studio albums. Love him or hate him, obviously I hate him, but whatever. But love him or hate him, you can't deny the legacy he left behind. Anywho, that's one major point out of the way. But there's still another big one to talk about. The correlation, or quote-unquote correlation, between race and crime. More specifically, racial bias in law enforcement. Now keep in mind for this particular bit, I will not be talking about O.J. Simpson. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, watch my reaction and you'll find out. More specifically though, I'd like to talk about something else. I did have a little bit of difficulty finding some info on this, so mostly I'll discuss a little bit what I did in the episode and sort of elaborate a little bit further. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not. Knowing the creators, it probably was, but the parody in this episode obviously related to law enforcement and racial bias. For those of you who don't know, racial bias basically relates to the attitudes and stereotypes of certain races that can affect one's judgment of specific individuals, whether unconscious or unconscious in nature. The idea of racial bias is especially prevalent in the idea that white law enforcement holds a negative racial bias towards African Americans, thinking they're more likely to commit crimes than, say, other white individuals, even in similar financial brackets. I feel like that idea that I have was basically confirmed when Officer Yates was having that conversation with his wife. He was rescinding certain thoughts when he realized they weren't going after a black, rich person, but a white one, and he wanted to seek out the truth to prove that Mr. Jefferson was black in order to have justification in pursuing legal action against him. This is a sad but somewhat accurate parody of what happens in real life, in my opinion at least. The idea of all these white cops from different places talking about framing black individuals kind of reaffirms this parody, unfortunately. African Americans are more often presented in a much greater negative or threatening context in the news compared to white individuals, based on studies and my own observations of news and society. Racial bias can often create problems for both law enforcement as well as African American individuals or even those considered to be minorities in society. I'm betting some people could be thinking, "You're a white girl. You couldn't possibly understand anything about this." And you're partially right. I've been white all my life, so I don't really experience racial bias in any way. But that doesn't mean I don't have personal experience with it. I'm positive I've mentioned him before, but I did have an ex-boyfriend who was African American. And no, I didn't date him because he was African American. No, I didn't break up with him because he was African American. That's just stupid. But we did date for 3 years and we were very close. To me, race never mattered. And I feel like we were lucky enough to live in a place where racial bias wasn't really a thing. But there are plenty of other places, other towns and cities in the United States that probably wouldn't have been the same, that might have changed the circumstances. Maybe I could have still dated, but he could have had a rougher time. Who knows? But it could have happened. And that's not the only personal experience I have. Did you guys know that my grandfather is African American? Yeah, he's from Morocco. Still got a great and thick Moroccan accent to boot. Now hold on, before you go rushing into the comments, let me clarify first. He may be my grandfather, but he's not my biological grandfather. He did, however, marry my grandmother, who is white, before I was even born. I grew up with him as my grandfather, and I knew he wasn't biologically related to me, but that didn't matter because he was still my grandfather. He was still family to me, and he treated my sister and I like granddaughters. We were all family to one another. My family and I used to live in Minnesota, and my mom used to work in a clothing store in the Mall of America. I don't remember which one specifically, but that doesn't matter. And her manager, her boss, was very racist, according to my mother anyways. Whenever she saw anyone who wasn't white walk into the store, she'd tell my mom, "Keep an eye on that person. Keep an eye on that individual. Make sure that couple doesn't steal anything." I'm pretty sure my mom just rolled her eyes every single time she heard this nonsense. But at one point, Mom was working on some things and her boss all of a sudden comes over and says, "There's this white woman and this black man in the store. Keep an eye on them both." My mother looks up and no joke, it's her mother and stepdad. My mother quit on the spot. I always get a kick out of that story. My general point is, racial bias is still a thing, even if that was years ago. It still exists and it still happens. Granted, I haven't heard anything lately, but it's possible that those kinds of things still happen with my grandfather to this day. And that makes me a little bit nervous for him. It makes me a little bit nervous for all the people that I know in my life who are probably considered minorities. Have they been racially discriminated against? Are they going to be? Now, some people may think that I pity those individuals, and that is not even close to being the case at all. There are parts of me that will occasionally fear for others, especially those friends and family in my life, because I care for and love them so much. But I can promise that none of this is pity. This is just a simple desire to wish that there wasn't racial bias at all. But unfortunately there is, and there probably will be for a long time. Everybody's got racial bias though, but it's good to be conscientious of it and not let those stereotypes and those biases dictate your actions. Phew, that was a rough one. But anyways, let's go ahead and shy away from that topic for the time being because I've said all I wanted or needed to say on that topic. Let's instead focus on a couple of other little random miscellaneous points that I discovered while I was researching this episode. Stone and Parker resisted the idea for a while to make an episode on Michael Jackson since it seems so base and cliche. You know, making fun of Michael Jackson. That idea anyways. Seems so cliche. But they ignored it for so long they eventually decided to do it and ended up making it more about Blanket than Jackson himself, which I'm not terribly opposed to. Either way, they still seem to have quite a fun time making fun of MJ. Stone and Parker also initially had Cartman and Michael Jackson making out during that dream sequence that Stan had, but Comedy Central said no, and asked him to cut that specific scene. Maybe for the best. I personally was fine with the implications alone. I did not need to actually see that. And please guys, I don't want anybody giving me flack for not recognizing Kenny when he was in the episode. Speaking of Kenny Death. "Oh my god, they killed Kenny, you bastards!" That was actually really funny and really unexpected. It's been a while since I've seen Kenny die. But that is all that I have to share for this particular review. And normally I tend to be a little bit iffy with words, but I don't think that I was iffy with words in this case, so I'm gonna let the review stand as is, and let what I said stand as my official opinion on these matters. So anyways, thank you for watching, I hope you guys enjoyed these videos, and as usual, until the next video, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here, welcome to another review for South Park. This is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 7, Goobacks. That's a weird freaking title. Sort of a random note, I've noticed lately that some of my reviews tend to be a little bit lackluster in terms of emotion, so I'm gonna try to do my damnedest to put a little bit more emotion into this. Let's try it. Yeah, that's literally all I'm going to say about that. Before I get on to a recap and review of the episode, don't forget all of the links in the description down below. There is of course a link to the actual reaction, no surprise there, that's how I always do things. But there are also some links to some artist profiles who have helped me with the sprites and the thumbnails throughout the entirety of the season so far. They've done a great job, by the way. Thank you so much, Chloe and Moon. There's also a link to the Discord server in which I am semi-active. I say semi because I've been really busy lately. But there is also a Patreon now. Again, I am still accepting a bunch of support on Patreon. I'm going to be making a couple of changes in the future, and I'm actually going to be putting a little bit more focus on my Patreon in the coming weeks, I think. I mean, I was already kind of planning on doing that, but, you know, just saying. Anyways, there's all the intro stuff out of the way. Let's focus on something else a little bit different. Namely, the review of this particular episode. Again, the episode title is Goobacks. It's still freaking weird. I mean, I kind of get it, but it's still weird. Which obviously starts with a recap of the episode. Immigrants from the future begin arriving in the present day and in South Park in droves. Things are so bad in the future that the immigrants are doing any jobs for barely any money and taking most jobs even from folks like Randy. You know, Stan's dad. Many people are not happy about it, especially Stan of all people, so there's a subset of rednecks trying to do something about stopping more and more people from coming from the future. There are a couple of topics that I want to talk about for this particular review. The first one being immigration. I suspected early on in the episode, but I didn't state it until the end, that the episode was an allegory for immigration, you know, being from the future instead of another country. The idea for this episode had been kicked around by Stone and Parker for some time, but they had some trouble making it without just being newsbeats all the time, but eventually they caved and just did it. I kinda knew this already, but I just needed to be confirmed to be sure because, you know, when it comes to references, when it relates to real life, sometimes I can be a little bit iffy with that. But the whole idea of them taking our jobs, they took our jobs, comes up every like 3 to 4 years, according to Stone and Parker, to which one of them just said, "Shut the fuck up." Apologies for cursing, but I'm just reiterating. I'm not saying, just reiterating. Speaking of the whole they took our jobs, they took our jobs, the whole redneck conversation with, you know, people taking their jobs and the whole global warming thing, it was later on in the episode, but it felt like some expectation subversion to me and was utterly hilarious. I know for a fact that I laughed a number of times. I guess I can't say I'm terribly surprised, but the episode did satirize illegal immigration and the reactions of both sides who attack or defend immigrants, without discussing the underlying causes. And by that I mean, there are two sides. One who attack immigrants, one who defend immigrants, maybe there's a little bit of a gray area, but more focus on the extremes between the attack and defending, but none of the sides are actually focusing on the underlying problems behind it all. You know, overpopulation, third world countries not having enough food, those kinds of things. Those are underlying problems that neither side seems to inherently try and fix, which I can understand why, because trying to fix big problems like that takes a lot of time. You can't just do it immediately. Speaking of things taking time and not happening immediately, that kind of brings me into another smaller point that I want to discuss a little bit, mostly because I kind of mentioned it in the episode already and talked a little bit about it, but I also just have a personal fascination with this topic, evolution. I know it can be a touchy subject for some people, but I am a scientist, especially when it comes to biology and evolution. I love that stuff. Again, it was a minor topic that I brought up briefly and discussed a little bit during the reaction, again, only briefly, because it was interesting that the future, like, you know, had no racism, but everyone is sort of brown and they're hairless, but everyone's also broke and they all wear jumpsuits, everybody's practically the same. You know, as a scientist, given what I've studied related to evolution, this seems highly unlikely, you know, everyone being the same, even in the near or far future. Again, this is strictly in my opinion, but whether 1,000 or 2,000 years into the future, it doesn't matter. There was a little bit of an error, I could tell, but I didn't really discuss it because it was like, well, it's still the future, who cares? I can't be too scientific and specific like I usually am, but whether it's 1,000 years or 2,000 years, humans have spent centuries dividing further and further into varying religions, skin tones, languages, financial brackets, such and such, that it seems odd for humanity to de-evolve like that in such a short period of time. 10,000 years? Like I said in the reaction? Maybe. But 1,000 or 2,000? Devolving that much? After all of the evolving and changing that we have done in just, like, you know, the span of a few centuries? Highly unlikely. Again, strictly my opinion. There is one more little topic that I want to talk about, and I don't want judgment from anybody. I said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. I do not frick with time. Now, yeah, there are a whole bunch of movies out there, Hot Tub Time Machine, Terminator, Back to the Future, etc., where time travel is a huge aspect of the story or the plot or whatever. And actually, come to think of it too, I think Avengers Endgame also technically involved time travel as well. No, didn't technically, it did. But most of the movies that a lot of people are familiar with that do involve time travel tend to be a little bit on the older side. People may have a different definition of what older might mean. When I say older, I typically mean 20th century. There are some 21st century stuff that did involve a little bit of time travel, but most of the big ones, most of the popular ones that people were really familiar with were movies from the 20th century. But honestly, I'm a brand new soul. I don't really care much for some of the older stuff. I know of it, but that doesn't mean I really care for it and like it, and that's partially what makes me so uncultured. Doesn't matter if it's movies, media, entertainment, music, anything like that. Usually, if it's older than the 90s, I generally don't care too much about it. I'm sorry if I've disappointed anybody, but I'm being serious here. Not every movie is for everybody. Though, that being said, I may be a little bit of a new soul, but even some of the stuff from the mid to late 2010s, yeah, nah. Not everything, but most stuff. But honestly, in general, due to the age of a lot of the movies that I mentioned earlier, and the fact that I generally don't like the idea of time travel in entertainment, I've either not seen a lot of these movies, or I've seen very few scenes of these movies. Again, do not judge me. Again, from movies like Terminator, Back to the Future, Groundhog Day, Hot Tub Time Machine, Donnie Darko, Edge of Tomorrow, and I think, there was a TV series called Outlander. I think my mom has seen it, she was actually really fascinated by it. I think that involves time travel as well, if I'm recalling correctly. Yeah, pretty sure I am. There are plenty of others too, some of them are newer, some of them are older, and I'm sorry that I don't have an interest in whatever people might call classics, but I really do not have an interest, so do not ask me to have an interest. Pretty please. All different kinds of movies, all different kinds of books and TV shows, everybody's got their own rules of time travel. Heck, I've even researched some explanations of time travel. As a writer, I love creating rules and worlds and ideas. Well, especially if, you're kind of a fantasy, sometimes goes into sci-fi writing. You love creating that kind of stuff. And what I typically like to use when I'm writing these stories is a combination of creativity, fantasy, but also especially logic. I love being creative and I love creating all these things, but I also like making it as logical and as scientific as I possibly can. But no matter what I do, I cannot find or I cannot come up with a satisfying way to explain time travel. I haven't for years, and so I never mess with time travel in my stories, and I often dislike any mention of time travel in movies and entertainment media. I will admit, mild time manipulation abilities, maybe I'll delve into since those are usually a little bit simpler to explain. I can immediately think of two characters from my stories, one of which actually from my comic, who do have the ability to manipulate time to an extent. But travel between different time periods while showing potential for distortion in the fabric of time-space itself? Absolutely not. Look, I can understand everyone's fascination with time travel, but I despise the subject. It's the one exception I do not touch with regards to my story creations. I will often give myself a lot of creative freedom, but time travel is the one subject I never ever touch. Sorry to rant so much, but I had to. I remember watching the South Park episode, My Future Self and Me. I don't remember, I think it was like a season 5 episode or something like that. And I remember as soon as I saw that there was a sort of time travel aspect to it, well, eventually it was kind of debunked, but it was kind of okay, and there was some other story elements happening, and I was like, okay, this seems okay. But then at the end of the episode, Cartman's actual future self comes from the future, and I'm just like, no, you were doing so well! It worked much better as a conspiracy than actual time travel in the South Park universe. I know this is the South Park universe, but come on! And then this episode just had to make it worse, with all of these time migrants, whatever the frick they are, coming from the future, and who knows if it's creating a distortion on the time-space continuum, or who knows if it's creating a completely separate continuity, or they're a parallel universe. I don't frickin' know! You see what happens when I start getting crazy about time travel. I try to explain it and I can't, and it just makes me ever so more mad. That made no sense, but I stand by what I said. Again, I am so sorry to rant, but this is a very touchy subject for me. I'll give myself a lot of creative liberties, but I don't frick with time for a reason. Okay, can we please get on to something at least a little bit more interesting, like some random miscellaneous stuff? Again, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be covering a whole lot of the references, or at least the entertainment references in this particular episode, either because I'm not very familiar with them, or I don't want to be. I mean, hey, if it's any consolation, I at least realized that there was an immigration factor involved in this episode. To be fair though, it was a little bit obvious, but it was still nice that I was able to recognize it without having to do research. Onto a couple of miscellaneous details though. Stone and Parker admitted to liking working on episodes like this that work on multiple levels. You know, with the whole immigration with the immigrants from the future instead of another country, and there being problems but nobody's trying to solve the underlying causes of the problem. And Stone and Parker knew perfectly well as well, that this episode was not meant to be funny, but rather was an episode meant for one to reflect. Which kinda makes sense when I rewatch it. I personally though will still never care for the time travel aspects of this episode. My future self and me, that was okay. But then you had to go and make this episode, and now I'm mad. But that's a personal problem, that's a personal bias. You don't have to take my word for it, but I just wanted to do a little bit of a rant explaining why I don't frick with time travel and why I don't like fricking with time in general, ever. So in summary, there were some immigration undertones, there was a little bit of weird evolution stuff that I covered, but that's not as big of a deal to me. And I really do not like anything related to time travel. I'll even admit, I love the MCU. I absolutely love the Marvel Cinematic Universe and so many of the movies that came out. But as soon as they started introducing time travel into the final movie, I started getting a little bit iffy. Luckily, there was the final battle, and with that, I didn't really give a damn anymore. But anyways, that is all that I have for this particular episode. Sorry, I went on a little bit of a personal rant, but I'm sure some of you can imagine why. So anyways, I'm going to end it there. Again, make sure to check out all the links in the description below, or at least check out as many as you possibly can. The support for myself, as well as the other individuals that have been helping me with this particular season, would be awesome. So thank you. But I hope you enjoyed this little ranting review, as well as the reaction, of course. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here, welcome to another review for South Park. This is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 8, Douche and Turd. In typical fashion for these reviews, make sure to check out all those links in the description below. There's the link to the reaction, there's the link to profiles of the artists who have been helping me with the sprites and thumbnails as of late, and of course there are links to my Patreon as well as my Discord server, so do go ahead and check out as many of those links as you possibly can. Anyways, onto the review of this episode. Okay, not true, there is something I kinda want to say first. I've been noticing lately, especially in some Season 8 reviews, that I've been getting a lot of comments on various videos. Again, there are plenty of positive ones, of course, but there are also some that may disagree with my opinions a little bit. Not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing. There has been plenty of constructive criticism and plenty of people pointing out plenty of good points relating to some of my opinions and some of my research. Honestly, if I had more time, I probably would do a little bit more research, but unfortunately, I have to do research only in little bits. So there's only so much that I can actually research and so much that I can actually talking about regarding my reaction or information regarding to events that South Park is referencing, or celebrities. So do feel free to criticize me, but try not to criticize me too harshly, as in some cases I may not have done all the research necessary. But with that, let's start the actual review of the episode, which starts off with a quick recap. Protesting from PETA forces South Park Elementary to change their school mascot from a cow to something else. Everyone isn't happy with the change, so Kyle and Kenny agree on the new mascot being a giant douche, while Cartman and Butters opt for Turd Sandwich, and Stan doesn't care as he finds both options dumb and ridiculous. I don't blame him. But for refusing to vote or failing to understand the importance of voting, Stan is soon banished from South Park until he learns his lesson. Stan does encounter some PETA members as a result of this, and some weird things happen, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. Obviously, the biggest reference throughout the entirety of this episode was general election and voting. Now initially I thought the episode was making a joke specifically about the 2004 election, but I didn't realize that the election joke is typically just repeated every 4 years in South Park. Kinda makes me wonder if they'll make an allusion to elections in the future, or use dramatized versions of real candidates eventually. I don't know, I mean, I think it could definitely be possible, especially with, you know, Obama and Trump, but that's just my opinion. I don't normally do this, but I did end up doing a little bit of research during the election and found out that the 2000 election was not Bush versus Gore as I initially thought, but was actually Bush versus Kerry. It didn't sound terribly familiar to me in the reaction, and it kinda sounds vaguely familiar even nowadays, but that's not the important part. What is important is that the episode was made to be how Stone and Parker felt about the actual election at the time. Everybody getting up in your ass about voting, but, you know, they didn't care which individual was president. There was a stand-up guy, they vote for said guy, but they're not gonna play the game of picking between a douche and a turd, as they so hilariously put in their Season 8 commentary. However, I will admit to understanding this point of view. My thoughts about voting in elections were incredibly similar for many years. I think a big part of it was that I didn't really understand the importance of voting, but also that I had no interest because I didn't really like anybody. I also didn't really get people or know people or like people in general, but that was just a personal problem. Now, in recent years, I have been a little bit more on the fence, but at least overall, I do tend do understand the importance of voting a lot more than I used to. I've watched a lot of episodes throughout the season and throughout this series so far. 7.5 technically at this point. Now there are some times where I definitely get the references, but not always do they hold the same relevancy today as they did when they were first aired, especially some of the episodes from the earlier seasons. But this episode, totally different story. This episode would absolutely hold relevancy even today. I mean, for an election, do you choose between a douche or a turd? I think a lot of people felt this, especially during the Trump v. Clinton election in 2016. I certainly know I felt that way. And I wasn't even registered to vote at the time, but I was also living in another state unofficially for college, so it was a bit of a weird situation. Or maybe it wasn't as complicated as I made it out to be. Point is, I still didn't vote. No flack for that, please. I honestly hated both candidates for varying reasons, and I suspect that I wasn't the only one. It seemed like one was a douche and one was a turd, which seems to happen a bunch in recent elections now that I look back, even if I wasn't and I'm still not politically active. Heck, I don't even like talking about politics in random or general conversation. To be honest, I don't even know what I classify myself as. I mean, I think I'm an independent, but I don't know. I just hate politics in general, but you know what? No, not today. Not gonna go into that. But something I am gonna go into is actually something that I talked about a little bit during the episode. I called out during the episode that voting was a privilege. My wording may have been a bit confusing or debatable to some people, so let's see if I can clarify a few things. At the time that I was wording what I did, I focused a little bit less on the privilege part of my wording and more on the obligation. Voting may not necessarily be a privilege, especially with varying people having different definitions of the word and when it pertains to politics, but I still stand by saying that voting is not necessarily an obligation, since voting does have a choice aspect to it even if you have it. Again, I understand the importance of voting. That doesn't necessarily mean it's something I have to do, so nobody is gonna judge me for this, okay? Again, I am not politically active. I don't normally follow politics. It is never something I've had interest in. It is something that I know has created arguments with multiple people around me, so I never ever talk about it. So just please don't. Being politically active is one thing, but if you're gonna judge me on not voting when I probably should, just don't start that with me, please. But I will at least say this. I have a responsibility to vote since I am part of the US system, and I should put my voice out there when looking for individuals to represent myself on the local or state or federal level. I have the right to vote because of what has happened throughout history to grant voting ability to varying peoples. I have the privilege to vote because I am a law-abiding citizen, but I am not obligated to vote since that alone is my choice whether to vote or not based on options available or moral opinions or personal feelings, etc. You see how complicated this can get? If you want to criticize certain aspects of my opinions, that's fine. Just please, no flack for not voting every single time when I have the ability to. That's all I'm asking, and that's all I'm gonna say further on the matter because politics is not really my thing to talk about. Okay, maybe let's try transitioning to a little bit of something else. Something that I was wondering about throughout the entirety of this episode and wondering if there was a specific aspect to it that was a reference to real life, and that's PETA. First off, I said it in the reaction, I'll say it again here. PETA attacked the school 47 times before, each time regarding the mascot if I'm not mistaken. First off, I have to ask, why was the 47th time special? Like, why was it not done before? South Park logic, that's all I can attribute that to. Now, I will admit to not knowing quite enough about PETA during my initial reaction, but my initial assumptions weren't too far from the truth. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure plenty of you, especially in America, know, PETA is basically an organization with the acronym standing for People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. The extreme nature of PETA's efforts throughout the entirety of this episode, shitting in broad daylight, having a goat as the wise leader of a PETA community, people marrying animals, and even having kids with animals, may allude to the general joke that PETA often takes things a bit too far, which after doing, again, just a little bit of research, I can kind of understand why. Take the official court case of Cetacean versus Bush, for example, which actually occurred in 2004, the same year that this episode was released. The case basically stemmed from the cetacean community, or at least an attorney representing the quote-unquote cetacean community, like, you know, whales, dolphins, and porpoises and stuff like that. But basically the community argued on the Navy's use of sonar that can disrupt cetacean behavior and cause tissue damage, or at least that's what they claimed. The decision was eventually made by the end of the case that animals can't sue unless Congress makes it clear in statute that animals can sue. Animals still can't sue, if anyone was wondering. Based on the research I have done, those associated with PETA generally tend to follow or agree with the following positions. They oppose speciesism, the idea that one species, aka the human race, is more important than any other species. Some consider pet to be a very derogatory term. Many will oppose animal testing of any kind. They tend to be a little shaky with support of certain service dog programs. They strongly support animal rights of varying kinds. They do receive many donations every year, and they do have millions millions of supporters. Even so, they are still the subject of controversy. A Twitter anti-animal post with changing phrases like bring home the bacon to bring home the bagels. Publishing an article saying real feminists should not consume eggs because feminists should be advocates of women's reproductive rights. PETA made a video that compared animal insemination and abuse to rape and sexual abuse of humans. There have been plenty of euthanasia promotions and controversies associated with PETA. There was a dairy and autism correlation uproar in which PETA seemed to be under the belief that dairy caused autism. Heck, PETA even said some nasty things about the late Steve Irwin. Again, I'm not necessarily going to go into the details of a lot of this, but I think you understand that there is quite a bit of controversy that does tend to surround PETA. During my reaction, I said I wasn't entirely sure if there was controversy, but I also knew that they were kind of a legitimate organization, and I was right on both counts. They are a legitimate organization, and I'm sure that there are plenty of angels that are really trying to do some good work there, but there are some people who might take it a bit too far. I guess kind of as evidenced by a whole bunch of random controversy that they're often associated with. Sure, they get lots of donations and they do have millions of members and probably even hundred thousands more supporters, but that doesn't change the fact that there are some individuals within that organization that do seem to take things a step too far. Maybe even a couple steps too far. I couldn't find direct correlation with certain events in the episode tied to real life events. It was kind of hard, but I figured that they were just kind of making fun of PETA in general. Who knows if they'll do it again in the future. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But at least for this review, I figured that talking about PETA was worth a little bit of a mention. Well, that seemed like a little bit more of a mention than just a mention in this particular case, but still. I think it's pretty clear how Stone and Parker feel about PETA, given how they made various PETA members do some pretty outlandish things throughout the entirety of the episode. Even at the very start of the episode. Like, come on, the South Park Elementary mascot being the cow? Seriously, you're gonna have a problem with that? Based on the quick scrolling that I did, a lot of schools and universities and whatnot have animals as mascots. It's not that big of a deal. Some schools will even take it a step further and have live animal mascots, but that's not a lot of them. But still, really? PETA's gonna make a big deal about that in the South Park universe? Okay. We all knew that they were weirdos, and took things a little bit too far. With that though, let's switch it back over to one more topic that I do want to talk about, probably something that would interest people the most, talking just a little bit about the characters. Now before I get to what I would call the main event, I just want to point out first that it was absolutely fascinating to see Butters and Cartman on the same side, with Cartman not actually taking advantage of Butters as he normally does, since Butters was already on his side. Yes, Cartman did get Butters to help him spread the word of picking his option for, the Turd sandwich as the new mascot, but his past manipulations have been much worse. This time around, it seemed either very tame or non-existent in terms of his manipulation of Butters, but it was still really interesting to see them on the same side of things, and see Cartman not bully Butters since Butters kind of agreed with him at the beginning. And that was just a little thing. On to the main event. It happened. It finally happened. I finally said F you to a character other than Cartman, and it was Kyle of all characters? One of the big plots of the episode was Stan's difficulty with voting with anything because both options, the douche and the turd, just sucked. Not to mention he also didn't really understand the importance of voting. Kyle attempted to convince Stan that voting was important, but only to get belligerent when Stan votes for Cartman's pick instead of Kyle's. I will at least say that it fits a little bit with Kyle's character that he would do anything to get one over on Cartman, but Stan and Kyle have been like the best bros for a long time. It was almost jarring to see Kyle completely ignore Stan's concerns and feelings in this case, simply because he wanted to beat Cartman. I think it would have been interesting to see these two characters argue in a way, but it almost felt a little bit one-sided, because while Kyle was literally on one side of things, Stan was in a state of uncertainty, and Kyle still decided to be a little bit of a dick towards Stan. At the same point, it was utterly fascinating to see them not necessarily not on the same side, but to see them not in the same level of communication as they typically seem to be. With Stan not understanding the importance of voting, and Kyle not understanding Stan's dilemma because of his hyper-focus on Cartman. I'm a little interested to see if a plot point like this will reappear in a future South Park episode. Again, having two very similar characters like Stan and Kyle just duking it out sounds absolutely fun, but for these two characters in particular, to see one on a literal side of things and another one just not sure what side that they'd fall under, that's an interesting conflict to look at, especially for the South Park best bros of Stan and Kyle. But holy crap, was I just so mad at Kyle at the time. I actually told him to F off during the reaction. I mean, I know he's a fictional character and he can't hear me, but I still said it anyways. In that case, Kyle really did need to F off. He's an 8-year-old kid, so I doubt he realized just how much of a dick he was being to Stan. In a way, Kyle was emulating Cartman. He was basically using Stan to get what he wanted so that he could beat Cartman. That's a Cartman tactic. All I know at this point is that if something like this is gonna happen again, it's gonna be interesting, especially if it's between Stan and Kyle. If it's between two other characters, it might not have the same impact, but if it's a situation like this between the characters of Stan and Kyle in particular, ooh, this could be interesting. And on a random miscellaneous side note too, I did not realize how much time there was between the release of episode 7 and episode 8. It was months. I want to say it was like between April and October. Like April was the episode 7 and October was episode 8 or something like that. It was many months between those episodes, but it was because Stone and Parker were actually working on Team America at the time, which even they said themselves in the season 8 commentary was a little bit of a difficult process, and I guess I could see that. And with that Team America reminder, hopefully I'll be able to remind myself to watch that relatively soon. We'll see what happens. Maybe after season 8 finishes up? I don't know. But that is all that I have for this particular review. Wow, this is gonna be a long review. This is probably the longest of the season thus far. But that does mean I'm gonna have to spend a little bit more time editing it, but knowing me, I'll do my damnedest. Anyways, time to end it there. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Again, please don't give me flack for the whole voting thing. And of course, constructive criticism is always helpful. Just try not to be too harsh on me, especially considering that I do some research, but I probably don't do all the research because doing all the research would take a lot of time. Time which I simply do not have for these reactions and reviews. But I'm dropping in here. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction as well as this review. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. What up, guys? Otterpop here. Welcome to a new review. This is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 9, Something Wall-Mart This Way Comes. Now, before I start off this review, you guys know the drill. Check out all the links in the description below. There's my Patreon, there's my Discord server, there's links to the artists who've helped me out with the art for like the thumbnails and the sprites. I mean, and of course there's a link to the actual reaction, but again, you guys all know this by now. You know, I kind of get the feeling that this is going to be a long one, but I'm not entirely sure, so let's go ahead and get started with a quick recap of the episode. A new Wall-Mart has set up shop in South Park, but a bunch of the small businesses in the town are shutting down because of it. Like the rest of the townsfolk, Cartman has been brainwashed into preventing harm from coming to the establishment and ending its amazing discounts and easy shopping. But Stan, Kyle, and Kenny want Wall-Mart to get out of their town. Now, obviously, the biggest reference or riff in this episode was the whole thing with big corporations. I mean, Wall-Mart in particular, but it could extend to big corporations in general, I feel like. Obviously, Wall-Mart is a play on Walmart. You know, Wall-Mart versus Walmart, 2 words versus 1, connected by hyphen, or the first one's connected by hyphen, I don't know. Walmart is known for having an economic impact whenever a new store is opened. Many small towns will lose businesses even a decade after a Walmart is placed. As South Park is a relatively small town, this makes sense that what happened in the episode would be the outcome. Probably not quite so fast, but still. But while small towns may feel this, larger towns usually do not feel the same negative economic impact. Even competition will often see a decrease in sales when a new Walmart opens up. The lower prices on many of Walmart's products may contribute to a variety of the things mentioned, and even so, there have been occasional issues with workforce like wages or working conditions, high turnover rates, etc., but there have been plenty of positive strides with things such as gender and sexual discrimination, or at least based on my research, that's what I found. Again, I was still pretty young when this episode came out, but apparently around the time that this episode did come out, many protests were happening with Walmarts around this time, especially with small towns, so the solution was just don't go, which is what the boys suggested early on in the episode, but no one seems to listen. I mean, the adults get brainwashed. This is South Park adult logic. That's what I would like to refer it to as. What? And you know, kind of like what happened with the episode, people protesting about Walmart still go there because the prices cannot be beat. I mean, I personally don't go to Walmart because I find a lot of their stuff to be lower quality. Part of this could be that my family rarely went to Walmart anyway, and I've been used to, let me explain before I continue, a middle-class lifestyle for a while, even nowadays as a fully independent adult. I'm used to going to IKEA for furniture, streaming shows and movies and videos online, getting arts and crafts materials from Michael's, getting a couple of bottles of good red wine a month. I'm used to stuff that's decent, or around medium quality at least, and I feel like I can't find that as often at Walmart. Sure, I'll sometimes go to Target for random things, but I prefer getting specific things at specific kinds of stores, you know, furniture, clothing, food, art materials, etc. While I'm not a huge fan of the many department type stores, I can understand why many people find them useful and would rather go to one location for a bunch of things instead of going to a few places for more specific things. The big point of the episode though, it's not the company, it's the consumer, a fact which I can agree with Stone and Parker on completely. Like I said earlier, there are still plenty of people that protest protest bringing Walmarts into places like small towns. But if you're really against them, don't shop there, which is what a bunch of people tend to not do. It's a whole big thing with supply and demand. If people are going to go to Walmart and buy stuff, then technically whether you like it or not, the demand for that increases. Therefore, they're going to supply the place, meaning the place is going to stay open longer. That's just common sense, right? Clearly not common sense for the South Park adults, but you know, maybe common sense for a lot of people that are living in this world today. You'd think at least. You'd hope. Now, the big point of the episode may have surrounded Walmart and big corporations, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other things for me to talk about. One big thing that I especially want to talk about for this episode? The characters. You know, I'm not sure why, but it was almost nice seeing that pretty obvious opposition between Cartman and Stan and Kyle. Now, yes, technically Kenny did support Stan and Kyle, but the latter were really the main focus. It was honestly nice to see them working together after the events of the previous episode, you know, Douche and Turd. Stan was in the spotlight a little bit because of Randy, more on Randy later, but there was a lot of spotlight on Kyle in particular because he correctly assumed Cartman's plan numerous times throughout the episode. He clearly knows Cartman well, and their relationship is still an interesting one to examine. I mean, come on, why is it that despite their constant bickering and practically opposite personalities, they still hang out with one another and still even work together on some occasions or consider the other their friend? How? How does that even work? But for sure, this episode definitely highlights that question, a question I still ask myself multiple times to this day. It was also amusing to see the potential weak-mindedness of Cartman given how easily he was brainwashed, shown even early on in the episode. I mean, Cartman bought 3 copies of Time Cop. Remarkably, he can math well and figure out that a 3-copy deal is $18, whereas 3 single copies are $9.99 each, leading to impressive savings. Not quite $20 as he initially assumed, but still. And unremarkably, he only has an interest in keeping all the copies for himself, an act in of itself which is incredibly pointless. I mean, come on, it's common sense. Why would you get 3 copies of the same freaking DVD for yourself? If you're gonna get it for somebody else, then I can understand, but if you're just gonna have it for yourself, why have 3 copies? It just makes no sense. You know, for as clever as Cartman can be sometimes, he is an amazing dumbass. He's definitely one of those characters who is not as smart as he clearly thinks he is, even if at some points he is as smart as he thinks he is. Don't tell him I said that. And apparently he's also a little bit of a violinist too. He pulled a violin practically straight out of his ass and just started playing it with decent efficiency. And the character I wasn't expecting to get as much spotlight as he did, Randy, like I was talking about a little bit earlier in the review. He got a little bit more of a spotlight in this episode, which I am not opposed to. Like Cartman and like so many of the other South Park adults of this town, he's got a weak-mindedness about him and he fell for Walmart's deals instantly. His hypocrisy was also on full display when he berates everyone for shopping at Walmart after they all promised not to, even though he was still going to Walmart anyways to shop for some stuff. And even so, Randy had some courage in helping Stan and Kyle at the end of the episode despite his brainwashed nature. Overall, it was nice to see all the negative qualities that Randy has, yet he is still a likable character in his own strange way. I just wonder if we'll delve more into other adult characters, since despite all my numerous complaints about South Park adults in the past, many seem quite likable in their own way, Randy included. In my personal opinion though, this episode definitely had some great moments regarding Walmart, or at least big corporations, or some kind of combination of the two, as well as its characters, but there are a whole bunch of other miscellaneous things that happened throughout this episode. Firstly, yes, I know there were lots of entertainment and movie references. I didn't realize most of them, nor do I care to talk too much about them since they really are just references. And you guys should all know by now that that is not my specialty in the slightest. There were just so many. The Time Cop reference is just one of them. But again, not gonna dwell too much on that. You guys should know this by now. And by the way, since I did mention it in the reaction, I did actually look it up. In early episodes, South Park was described as having about 4,300 people in the episode Chef Goes Nanners. And while it could be a slight bit bigger at this point in time, or even in the future, I imagine the population may barely exceed 6,000 at the largest throughout the series. I don't know that for sure, that's just a guess. Small town classification has anywhere between 2,500 and 25,000 people, meaning no matter how large the South Park population is, it absolutely qualifies it as a small town. Which also means that there is absolutely a justification for how Walmart managed to impact South Park. Again, I don't think it would have impacted it quite so quickly, but it explains how it did leave a major impact on the town in general, or at least the businesses. And there is kind of one more topic I'd like to elaborate on before I finish up. I'm talking about the reference to Cartman talking about how you shit when you die is an idea that is partially true, as I discussed in my reaction, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Quick spoiler alert for both discussing an unpleasant topic as well as some high vocabulary usage in the next couple of minutes. If you'd rather avoid this, just go ahead and check out that timestamp that just appeared on the screen. I said that after death, rigor mortis sets in where the body relaxes. This was a poor summation of events, and I will clarify all that right here. Pallor mortis, or the paleness process of death, and algor mortis, the cooling of death, usually set within an hour after death. Livor mortis, the blue color of death, occurs as blood begins to pool in the body due to gravity. If you don't understand what I mean, I actually created a taphonomy video not too long ago that can better explain this. But during this period of time, the muscles will occasionally spasm, and once these spasms cease, what follows is rigor mortis, the stiffening of death, which usually occurs between 2 to 12 hours after death. Tissue decay begins once rigor mortis reaches its peak, during which the muscles throughout the body begin to relax. This is often when a body will urinate or defecate. As I said during the reaction, it's often a fairly small amount. If there was urine in the bladder or any excrement near the end of the large intestines, that is. And interestingly enough, if an individual has suffered trauma, physical trauma, during their life at some point, the likelihood of bowel control loss increases drastically during this period after death. So again, some of you may have listened to my reaction and been like, oh, that's exactly what happens, but no, that's not entirely true, so I'm hoping that this clarifies it a little. Again, I apologize for the uncomfortable subject, but it's something that I wanted to clarify and talk about, especially because this is a topic I'm very familiar with. Phew, now that we've got all the nasties out of the way, let's check the script real quick just to make sure I got everything. I'm pretty sure I absolutely did. Recap, corporations, Wall-Mart, talking about the characters and some miscellaneous stuff, including some nasty stuff. Yeah, looks like I got it all covered. With that, that is going to be the end of this review. Again, do not forget to check out all of those links down in the description below. I've got a Discord server that's always open to new members. I'm always accepting some more support on my Patreon, which is due to change relatively soon. And of course, the artists that have been helping me out with these South Park reviews should absolutely be commended, and their profiles should be checked out, so go ahead and do all that. But with that, that is the end of this review, so thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. What up, guys? Otterpop here. I cannot wait for this video. This is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 10, Preschool. I don't really think I'm lying when I say that I bet a lot of people have probably been really looking forward to this particular review. But as usual, before I get started, don't forget about all the links down in the description below. Links to things like my Patreon, the Discord server, the actual reaction to this particular episode, and of course to the profiles of the artists who have helped me out with these particular South Park episodes. So with that, let's get started with the review. Quick recap of the episode: an individual named Trent Boyette is getting released from juvenile hall, and he's got a score to settle with the boys since he took all the fall for a fire incident in preschool that wasn't completely his fault. The boys are justifiably terrified. Butters tries to hide in his home, and the main crew unsuccessfully get help from 6th graders before they're left to deal with Trent on their own. Trent, by the way, serious vendetta against them. I really don't think I'm out of line when I say that the big hook for this particular episode is that the South Park kids are in littler versions. That is absolutely the big hook of the episode. But you cannot deny the adorableness of those kids, because Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny were freaking adorable as preschoolers. Even Cartman. And to be completely honest, I was not expecting a Butters version also, but that was a pleasant surprise, and I was uber excited to see all of their cute little versions in those cute little preschool outfits with those adorable voices, and that was so cute! Even Stone and Parker considered the tiny South Park versions cute. They said so in their Season 8 commentary. Apparently these sort of little kid preschool versions appeared in a previous episode, but I don't remember, and it doesn't really matter because this episode was absolutely perfect for a little bit of a flashback episode. Also in the Season 8 commentary, Stone and Parker say that this started from the idea of South Park Kids. Other shows do episodes where the creators go, oh, let's do a kids version. So Stone and Parker decided to go the same route with a flashback episode and create these adorable little South Park babies, even though they're in preschool, but I don't care. They're still South Park babies to me. During my reaction, I stated that unlike previous episodes where the episode would reference a big event or a celebrity, etc., the primary focus of this particular episode was just to tell a story, even if there were a couple of references sprinkled in, because this is South Park. Every episode is going to have a reference of some kind sprinkled in, or by multiple references. But I feel like more than anything, this particular episode just wanted to take a little concept and just roll with it and tell a story with it. And you know what? I am never opposed to something like that. For one thing, that means I don't have to do crazy amounts of research to figure out specific references and not get them initially and then get them later and then talk about it, but now I really don't need to worry about that hassle. But of course, by the end of the episode, I feel like there was a lesson that was starting to be learned from the boys, but that ended up just not being the case. I even mentioned it at the end of my reaction that unlike previous episodes, the boys clearly did not learn anything from this, even after Shelley convinces them to try and admit to Miss Claridge in their involvement with the accident from preschool. Not to mention they also basically repeat the same mistake from 5 years earlier. I mean, the first was more of a logical misunderstanding, and the second time around, the present day incident, was a legitimate accident when Cartman accidentally used his mom's taser on Miss Claridge's vehicle thingamabob. And I will say, for most of these episodes when I do the reviews, I usually do them assuming that people have at least seen the episode whether they like it or not. Seriously though, you cannot deny it. Those South Park preschoolers, and Butters especially, but even the four main boys and Butters, were just super freaking adorable, and I cannot get over that. Alright, let's take a chill pill, let's tone it down because there are other things to talk about. The biggest thing being Trent Boyette himself. In the initial flashback, a few of Trent Boyette's words were bleeped, but he wasn't actually swearing and was just using normal language. Stone and Parker said so themselves. Even so, I think this was maybe a little bit of a smart decision. I think this fits well as this brand new character is introduced, giving the audience some insight as to how brash, fierce, and reckless he might be. I mean, he is a kid, and I'm sure that a lot of the other kids were the same way, but even so, more to an extreme with his particular character, with Trent's character at least. So that kind of creative decision to make him bleep out some words that weren't actually swearing or bad language, I think was actually a little bit of a smart decision on the creator's part. And I'm gonna correct an assumption that I made, but Trent's knowledge of starting fires immediately made me think of him as a psychopath, since pyromania can be an early sign of psychopathy in childhood, alongside other things like animal abuse and lack of emotion. But after rewatching my reaction, I actually think I have to retract this statement, as Trent only had knowledge of starting the fire, and when he started it and there was a misunderstanding about the boys being able to put it out, with their own urine I might add, Trent got angry because he was under the impression that they could be put out. Trent may be pretty intelligent and or resourceful, I mean he had a freaking lighter on him, although strangely he didn't have a lighter on him later on when he was giving back his stuff when he was released from juvenile hall, but I digress. He may also be a bit tougher than the other kids, but I don't really think that he's a psychopath as I initially snapped during my reaction, so just wanted to correct that. Funny enough though, Trent's character and quest for revenge are references to a story called Cape Fear. I believe it started out as a book and was then adapted into a movie a couple different times, but generally it follows the story of a convicted felon who stalks an attorney and the attorney's family, the former of whom helped place him in jail in the first place. Granted, I didn't really know too much about Cape Fear, but that seems like a pretty fun little nod too. Fun little tie into the story as well, since it literally, again, was just a flashback episode tied in with present-day storytelling that didn't really reference big events or celebrities like these South Park episodes normally seem to. Even near the end of the episode, Trent makes multiple references to previous episodes, all of which I remembered as soon as he said them. You know, Mr. Hankey's first appearance, the Mecha Barbara Streisand, which was from like the first season, I can't believe I even remembered that at all. And even Christmas in the Middle East. He was making all kinds of references and I'm like, oh hey, I actually know them all. You know, in all honesty, there's not too much more to say about this episode. There were some little references sprinkled in, but again, I'm not gonna go too far into them because that's all they are at this point. They're just kind of little nods here and there. But like I've already mentioned, most South Park episodes are created to talk about a relevant event or a relevant celebrity or something like that, maybe poke fun at those situations in sort of clever and subtle ways, and then have there be a lesson by the end of it. This wasn't one of those kinds of episodes though. Unlike most episodes of South Park so far where there's an intent of informing the viewer or retelling an event or making fun of an event or individual, this episode almost purely existed for entertainment purposes, to sort of tell a story in a ridiculous way. And you know, I'm not entirely opposed to that. Sure, it is certainly interesting doing all kinds of research on all different kinds of topics and people and places, learning new things and learning about the inherent cleverness of South Park episodes. And even though there are plenty of cartoons out there that might have episodes like this where they sort of de-age some of their characters in like a flashback or as a plot point or something along those lines, this episode just felt a little bit like a breath of fresh air. I felt like in a way it allowed us to explore the characters just a slight bit though, just a slight bit. Again, with the biggest thing being is that normally somebody learns a lesson by the end of it, usually the kids, rarely an adult, but even they don't actually learn it. But it seems like so often the kids will learn a lesson in some way, shape, or form, but this time they just didn't. Nothing stuck with them, they didn't learn anything new, there was just a story to be told, they made a same mistake that they did in preschool. It really makes me question some of the characters now. Not necessarily Cartman. God knows I could talk about Cartman. But even the other boys didn't seem to have any qualms at all, with Trent going to jail for essentially what they did in preschool and again what they did in 4th grade with Miss Claridge. We've seen Kyle get guilty before at doing something even super mundane, but now he just chooses not to have a conscience or something like that. I even would have expected Stan to maybe consider things and potentially take a stand against some of this craziness, but even he doesn't. I expect Kenny to either be on the fence or just kind of follow along with his friends and not really have his own opinionated nature. But if you really think about it, it does kind of bring you back to the fact that they may learn things from time to time, but they're also kids too. They're still 8-year-olds. They still have their faults. They still have a lot to learn, and they're still gonna make stupid mistakes no matter what they are, or how old they are. Childhood is the phase of growth and development, and these kids still gotta learn that. Technically, they're never really aging throughout the entirety of the series, except when it's shown that they actually did transition from 3rd grade to 4th grade, but still. But maybe that's the point of the episode. Not every episode is going to end with everything all wrapped up in a neat little bow. Sometimes a story is just a story, and not everything technically has a happy ending. In that, not every time do the kids actually learn some kind of lesson of some sort. I get the feeling that a lot of fans will love and remember this episode because of the fact that they were in such tiny little versions and because it was so adorable. Don't get me wrong, I love that aspect too. I think that's freaking adorable. But I don't know whether or not Stone and Parker intended it, but there is some subtle genius to this episode as well. And I think this will honestly be one of my favorites for that very reason. Even an episode without a lesson at the end still has an indirect lesson. Again, I have no idea if this was intentional on Stone and Parker's part, but that's just what I'm taking from it. So while this episode may definitely have some cute moments, there is a little bit of subtle genius to this particular episode, and I hope you guys might think the same after listening to this particular review. But anyways, that is all that I have to say for this particular episode. It was so entertaining, and while there may not have been a lot of references or a lot to talk about, I still feel like there was some stuff to talk about, of course. So thank you all for watching, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here. Here's another South Park review. This is going to be the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 11, Quest for Ratings, and oh boy do I have a script ready for this one. I mean, I don't necessarily know how interesting it's gonna be, but let's just say I did a lot of research and I looked up a lot of things and I took some information for my reaction along with some new information, so let's just see how this goes. Before I start the recap, don't forget about my Discord server, my Patreon, which I'm still accepting support for. It would be really beneficial, but obviously you don't absolutely have to. And of course, don't forget to follow those links in the description below to the artist profiles who have helped me with the sprites and the backgrounds. Seriously, those two have done amazing work this entire season, and I could not be happier. Anyways, with that, let's jump to the recap. A group comprised of Cartman, Kyle, Stan, Token, Butters, and Jimmy have a school morning news show which they put a lot of effort into, but are soon caught up in competition of ratings against Craig's show, which is basically just compiling short videos with little effort. Now the first biggest thing that I want to talk about for this episode was news networks. I suspected during my reaction that the boys struggling to come up with ideas and literally creating ideas later was just satirizing news networks, which I kind of appeared to be a little bit correct on. There was more to it than that, but I'll elaborate a little bit later in this review. I also said in my review that, news networks would make stuff up or lie or exaggerate. The correct word I was looking for was sensationalize. I mean, they still probably exaggerate a little bit too, but they sensationalize in that news networks present information in certain ways that garners public interest, but often at the cost of some accuracy while relaying the news or telling a story. I also suggested during a reaction that there was a particular scene in the episode, one where Jimmy was talking about obligations as a journalist, but the rest of them were kind of just like, nah, let's just sensationalize. But I suggested that that scene in particular was an allegory for news networks. Jimmy was in the minority. He was an individual who wanted to tell the truth and express the need for social obligations in journalism, whereas Cartman, Stan, Kyle, Token, and Butters were in the majority, and they had no problem sensationalizing everything in order to get their ratings up. They didn't necessarily care about the accuracy of their stories. I considered that particular scene a potential allegory for how the majority of news networks, in my eyes and in my opinion, have more interest in sensationalizing stories rather than the minority who intend on telling the truth and collecting all the information on stories. I don't know if this idea was intentional or not, but my interpretation may still hold some merit. But I don't know for sure, but it's still just an idea to consider. On a little bit of a side note, the appearance of the boys, where their big poofy hair, which I later learned was fake, at least for Butters for sure, probably for the other boys as well. But that big old poofy hair, the wigs or whatever that they all seem to have, seems to parody either newscasters from the 70s and 80s, or Will Ferrell from Anchorman, a hilarious movie that even I have heard of, so I know what they're talking about when they're talking about those references, at least based on my research. Cartman telling Token to sound more white also during the episode references music in the 70s, where record companies would try to hide the African-American artists they employed because people might not listen to them if the public knew they were African-Americans due to the racism back then. Boy, what a different time that was. I think I was initially surprised that there wasn't so much information that was parodying news networks and stuff like that, but later I learned there was actually a bit of a different reason for why some of these scenes happened the way that they did. But at least I think in a way there was a little bit of a spoof on certain aspects of newscasting and journalism, and there were at least a few topics that I could talk about. Another little topic that I do want to talk about with regards to this episode are the characters. First off, the boys looked adorable in newscaster outfits. Stone and Parker said that they always loved to dress the boys up, such as, little Crime Stoppers when they were, little policemen and stuff. I mean, I can't argue with that. The boys really do look adorable when they're dressed up as stuff like, for the laundromat or as policemen or news anchors. It really is adorable. There is a brief thing I want to mention about Cartman, just a brief thing. But it almost seemed like this was one of the few rare times where Cartman seemed decent during this episode. I mean, except for the obviously racist talk with Token, who did not seem to argue it and even went along with Cartman's suggestion later on. But compared to most of the other instances where we see Cartman, he actually really wasn't as bad in this episode as I've seen him in previous episodes, which was a slight bit surprising, but you gotta mix it up every now and then, I guess. But the other major character I definitely want to talk about for this episode, Jimmy. Jimmy was definitely the MVP of this episode. I mean, for a while, but still. His comments on social obligations of news reporting and journalism were inspiring to say the least, and my respect for him went way up. It's always nice to see positive characteristics of these characters from time to time. I won't necessarily go into detail about other characters because I feel like that's a lot of information to cover. But at least for Jimmy in particular, knowing that he has such a strong opinion on this, and he seems knowledgeable in it, and that, at least for a time he wanted to have a social obligation to journalism and report some decent information and truthfulness rather than trying to sensationalize everything like the rest of the boys. They may be ridiculous brats from time to time, well, actually a lot of the time they are freaking 9-year-old 4th graders, but it is nice when we get to see some neat and positive characteristics that emerge from some of these characters from time to time. Especially characters like Jimmy and Timmy, who honestly are kind of becoming some of my favorites. I don't necessarily know for sure, but it is possible. Now, on to the next topic. It's a very little one, but I do kind of want to briefly mention it. The hilarious trip scene. Even I thought it was a little bit trippy. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know for sure if that's really what an acid trip or cough syrup trip looks like. I mean, I really wouldn't know. The boys tripping on the cough syrup is what people tripping on acid look like on the street, according to Stone and Parker anyways. I don't know this stuff. This is from their mouths. Also, according to Stone and Parker, they know you can't come up with good ideas on drugs or while tripping. They've tried. Honestly, I can't say I'm terribly surprised. Now, it's not necessarily in the same boat, but I was thinking something similar during my reaction. It's hard to come up with many good ideas in a short period of time, even while intoxicated. As a writer and an artist, I'm very familiar enough with that concept. I've never tried tripping on acid or cough syrup or drugs or anything like that in order to try and come up with ideas, and I honestly don't think I would. Clearly, according to Stone and Parker, it was unsuccessful, as evidenced by the fact that it was also unsuccessful for the boys. So no. And with that, let's switch it over to a topic that I believe should not go unmentioned for the review for this particular episode. The production craziness. When I was researching for the previous 3 episodes, and there's a reason that I'm mentioning this, I didn't really notice any distinct information regarding the production craziness. I'm not sure if I was just looking in the wrong spot or if I was just speeding up the reviews, but let's get this started. This episode marked the first time that Stone and Parker were officially out of ideas for South Park episode plots, because they were working on 7 episodes of season 8, they were working on Team America, there was post-production for that particular film, and then they were working on the last 7 episodes of season 8. They had scrambled with episodes 8 through 10 and were super burnt out by the point that they were working on episode 9. It was really interesting learning about a little bit of the production of this season in particular, mainly how the season was split up in 2, and how Stone and Parker were working on Team America World Police, a puppetry-based movie which itself had hassles. From what I understand, it barely made the release date. Like I mentioned in the reaction and earlier in the review, I initially thought the episode was an allegory for general news and media, like with the episode Child Abduction is Not Funny. I even mentioned it during my reaction. But the boys trying to come up with ideas for the show is basically an allegory for Stone and Parker trying to come up with ideas for this episode in particular. Crab People was actually referenced, since Crab People became a coined phrase amongst the South Park team for when you can't think of anything else and just end up using Crab People as a cop-out. Very clever reference, by the way. And the ending of the episode mirrored the frustration felt by Stone and Parker at the time, which, I mean, I can't blame them. They were already super burnt out with the first half of season 8, and then they had to work on that movie, which itself had so many hassles and barely made the release date in October, and then it's like, oh, we gotta work on the rest half of season 8. Lovely. Now granted, there's a little bit more information to it than just that, but I'll be sure to talk about that a little bit more in future reviews, because at this point, I'm mostly focusing on what was happening up to this point in the episode, and not necessarily say the next episode, or even episodes 13 and 14. I'll be sure to talk a little bit more on that later, especially by the time episode 14 comes around. And there is one more little miscellaneous thing that I kind of want to talk about, just real quick, because I kind of have to mention it. I was thinking about it during the reaction. The dogs and cats in Craig's videos, or at least some of them, did belong to Stone and Parker. Well, one was like Stone's dog and Parker's cat, or was it Stone's cat and Parker's dog, one of the two. So it's likely that other people associated with the South Park production had their animals featured also in Craig's little compiled video compilation thingamabob. Because apparently, people all the time want to see puppies on TV. I mean, can you really blame them? There is something out there called Animal Funniest Videos, right? I'm pretty sure that's what it is. AFV, Animals Funniest Videos, right? So yeah, can you really blame people for wanting to see cute dogs and cats with a wide-angle lens, or especially once they got little hats on? Like, come on, that's just adorable. Still, Craig did not put a lot of effort into that general production, and yeah. But anyways, that is all that I have for this particular review, so thank you all for watching. Don't forget to check out all those links in the description below, or as many of them as you can. I hope you enjoyed this video and the reaction, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here. This is going to be another review for South Park. This is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 12, Stupid Spoiled Video Playset. And yes, there is kind of a little bit of a reason that I say it like that. That's kind of what my family has said for a long time instead of saying the actual word, and you never know what YouTube might do, so yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it tour. I'll probably even spell it that way in the YouTube video as well. As usual, do not forget about all those links down in the description below. Stuff for my Patreon, my Discord server, links to the artist profiles who have been helping me for this season, at least in regards to the art, and of course the link to the actual reaction, because, you know, this is just the review. Which starts off with a quick recap of the episode. Paris Hilton's new store in South Park encourages the young girls of the town to become super spoiled, snobbish, and basically hooers. The boys are generally confused, and Wendy in particular is very dissatisfied with the changes, but it turns out Wendy's knight in shining armor may be... pause for effect? I'm just kidding, I'm pretty sure if you're watching this review you've already seen the reaction. It's Mr. Slave. Now, before I cover the topics that I really want to cover, just a quick, brief little moment. I talked a little bit about the production craziness from the previous episode, which I will mention a little bit more in the next episode, and especially in episode 14 as well. But for this particular episode, there isn't too much to say, and most of what I do have to say is just slight, and I'll already be mentioning in future reviews, so just know that there was still a little bit of production craziness going with this particular episode. Stone and Parker were still struggling to come up with some ideas, and the idea of bashing on Paris Hilton just kind of came to them and seemed like a good idea at the time based on the time period of things or something along those lines. But yeah, that's the basic gist of it. Speaking of Paris Hilton, oh boy, is there plenty to say about her. Granted, I knew the name a little bit and I was a little bit familiar, but not terribly familiar. Again, this episode did come out around 2004. I was still pretty young and didn't necessarily know a lot of this stuff. Technically speaking, I was right around the same age as these South Park characters were, or at least the South Park kids were, when this episode came out. Huh, how did I not realize that before? But yes, I knew a little bit of her by name, and that was literally just about it. Clearly, Stone and Parker knew her a little bit more by reputation, at least at the time. I mean, it was relatively obvious how Stone and Parker thought of her based on what happened in this episode. They were even talking about it in their commentary a little bit. They showed contempt for her whorish behavior. Like, you know, apparently even her promoters were not only telling little girls to laugh at her, but to be her as well. Stone and Parker also blatantly called her ugly, or at least they called her a total dog in their commentary, but also potentially one of the most miserable people on the planet. And they considered her a dumb biatch as well, seeing as how inebriated she often seemed to be during the episode, and even thinking of Butters as a new dog for her to keep. I mean, I know he's adorable, but he doesn't look like a dog or anything like that. Maybe a puppy, not a dog. Maybe not even a puppy, but I don't care. Funny enough though, Hilton's initial nickname for Butters was Little Puffball, which references Butters being called Puff Puff in storyboards before he was officially named by the South Park team. Apparently at the time in LA, nobody had anything nice to say about Paris Hilton, but nobody could wait to get into one of her parties apparently. I mean, she does seem like the party type. I'm not, but that's just me. Even the video playset in the episode is likely a partial reference to the SEX scandal involving Hilton that occurred only months prior to this episode's release. And you know what? Hilton actually reacted to the episode as well. Not like, you know, on YouTube, but you know, she watched the episode and then provided her own comments on it, which Stone and Parker eventually saw. And you know what she said? She said, and I quote, "I haven't seen it, but when people copy you, that's like the most flattering thing. So whatever people can say, I just laugh about it. It doesn't matter to me." What? Stone later responded to this, and I don't blame him. That shows just how effed up she is. That's terrible that she's flattered by it. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Stone and Parker basically insulted Hilton, and she's flattered by it? It makes no sense. If South Park ever did something like that of me, insulting some of my characteristics or personality traits, depending on how they did it, I'd certainly have a much more sophisticated and analytical response instead of being flattered by the flat-out insulting depiction. To clarify, I doubt South Park will ever do this. They'll probably cancel long before I actually catch up to the actual show. But I'm just posing a hypothetical. I'm talking about how I would react to something if I saw something like that of myself. Does that make sense? Whatever. She's weird, she's crazy, and I just don't want to talk about her anymore because I don't know too much about her, I don't know too much of the references, and frankly, based on the depiction, I'm not sure I want to. They really did not seem to like her. I mean, I know Stone and Parker like making fun of a lot of celebrities and important figures out there, but they really did not like her. But you know who I did like? Two characters in particular in this episode, and I'm sure that you already know who. One of them being Wendy. For one thing, I liked seeing immediately that it looked like it was going to be a Wendy-centric episode. I mean, yes, for one thing it's Wendy, but I also like that we saw a little bit more spotlight put on a secondary character. I always like episodes like that. Those tend to be some of my favorites. Not always, but often. Not to mention her even going to Mr. Garrison was unexpected, and especially getting Mr. Slave on her side was unexpected. Overall though, I was mostly happy that she did what she could to prove her point to everyone around her parents and her peers in particular, to keep her individuality. And you know that this episode wasn't like the Bebe's Boobs Destroy Society episode, where she tried to conform by the end of the episode, which even at the time didn't seem like something her character would do. Again, I was happy to not see that happen in this particular episode. Next to characters like Chef, she really is one of the most sane characters in this entire freaking town. Not to mention, Wendy reminds me a little bit of myself when I was younger, minus the outgoingness and the bluntness. Still fairly individualistic and opinionated. And intelligent. What was I saying? Yes, it's always a pleasure seeing Wendy being able to stand up for her own beliefs and opinions and quote-unquote the right thing, because usually she's one of the few characters who can seem to do that consistently throughout the show. Now initially when I started watching this episode, I figured I would have a lot to say on Wendy, but it turns out there's actually another character I'd like to say quite a bit about. Ladies and gentlemen, you know who it is. Mr. Slave! He was the only character in the entire episode that completely surprised me and utterly stunned me at almost every single turn. You know, once his character even appeared after showing Mr. Garrison suddenly, randomly, I honestly had no idea how the story would go. And I was surprised and delighted that he seemed to be taking Wendy's side and trying to teach the girls a lesson. I mean, initially I didn't get that vibe because I wasn't entirely sure, because the episode was going all kinds of back and forth all over the place, but let's just say I was overall pleasantly surprised. Also, the hurrah that happens near the end of the episode is likely a reference to the walk-off which happened near the beginning of Zoolander, which I already suspected, but it occasionally happens where I see, like, you know, these potential little references, but I don't necessarily say anything right away. It does happen from time to time, but I had already suspected because I have seen the movie, believe it or not. It actually had a reference. The South Park episode had a reference which I could actually understand and get. Hip hip hooray. But again, everything else was just so crazy I just didn't even have a time to process it or say anything about it. But trust me, I did actually recognize it. Also, that other scene at the very end of the episode with Mr. Slave jumping on Hilton, first off, it indicated that she will have to face the same perils as Lemmywinks from Death Camp of Tolerance. That was also a reference I immediately recognized. As soon as I saw that she was alive, I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is like Lemmywinks, and then the spirit of the ghost King Frog guy appeared and I was like, oh yeah, definitely. But secondly, holy crap. Of all the characters who could be giving us a life lesson, or could be giving a life lesson to the kids, or even some of the adults of South Park as well. Well, pretty much everybody in South Park at this point. But the one person I least expected to give out a life lesson was Mr. Slave. And Mr. Garrison was cheering him on silently in the crowd. Okay, well not silently, but he was still cheering him on a little bit. He was mumbling cheers. Either way, it was extremely unexpected as well as satisfying to be seeing a life lesson given to us by Mr. Slave, who at this point I've basically dubbed as one of the best underrated characters of South Park. I don't know if anybody feels the same way I do. Do you guys? Let me know. And of course, another little thing that I was thinking too after I'd already reacted to the episode was again Mr. Garrison softly cheering on Mr. Slave. Initially, I just laughed at it and thought it was just freaking adorable. When I had some time to really think about it, it really was adorable in a lot of ways. That despite these two weird, zany characters, I even thought that Mr. Slave would have been like one of those weird one-off characters or something. But despite that, these two odd and zany characters still have perhaps a little bit of a questionable, but also interesting and even in a weird way real relationship. They still care about each other, even again if the way that they care about one another is still very interesting and different from what most other people might think. To be fair, this is partially on me. I don't really know anything about homosexual relationships. I really don't. And at least in big part because I'm not one myself. I do know a lot of people who are that way, who are gay or lesbian. I've known lots of people who are, trust me. And while I can understand a little bit, I also can't fully understand, in part because of my asexuality, but also in part because I've never experienced that before. Having a relationship in that kind of way, at least. Not saying that it's a bad thing though, like people have the right to choose who they care about, who they love. Some people may surely show their affections in very different ways than others. Everybody everybody's different. Everybody's got their own way of handling relationships and affection and stuff like that. Heck, my sister and I show affection for one another by calling each other names and cursing at each other. In a very playful way though, I promise. But that's our way of showing affection, so other people might see it as weird, but we don't. We're used to it. We've been doing it for years. My point is though, despite their odd activities, there does seem to be some mutual connection with one another between Mr. Garrison and Mr. Slave. It's not exactly something I can properly identify, but I feel like I'm at least noticing it. Anybody correct me if I'm wrong in that assessment. They really do seem to care about each other, and again, their relationship may be weird and a little bit different from the norm, but they still do care about and support each other in a variety of ways, and that's something that I'd really like to see a little bit more of now that I'm really thinking about it. It could be really interesting. Now, that's all I've got to say about the Mr. Slave / Mr. Garrison characters, for the time being at least. Pretty sure I made my point. Anyways, now let's turn on to a couple of little random miscellaneous stuff. Now, the central focus did seem to be Wendy and Mr. Slave and the general concept of Paris Hilton being a dumb biatch. But that doesn't mean there aren't little things to notice from time to time throughout the episode as well. You know, believe it or not, Cartman actually did surprise me for a moment in this episode, in that he had interest in going to Bebe's party, since Bebe and the other girls were basically asking out every other guy to come to Bebe's party except for Cartman. I'm pretty sure I already deduced why, and it's not surprising. His personality and his weight. The girls in their current mental state would probably see those traits as undesirable. But it's also interesting to think about because Cartman doesn't often show interest in girls. I mean, their attire and personality changes could have had a little something to do with it, I don't know for sure. But the fact that Cartman had even taken an interest in them was such an unusual thing to see because he almost never takes an interest in anybody, regardless of gender or sexual identity. Although I can't necessarily say I'm terribly surprised that he probably follows a little bit more of a heterosexual route in terms of a character. Honestly, based on previous comments and his previous views that have been shown throughout various episodes, it wouldn't surprise me if he's a little bit homophobic. I mean, maybe that's been directly stated, I can't think of it at the moment, but it just seems like that would be a character trait of his. And Cartman wasn't the only one who surprised me. The other boys surprised me just a little bit as well. Again, a whole bunch of boys got invited to Bebe's party. Well, Bebe's party and a whole bunch of other girls were there as well. But given how much interest some of the boys have had in the Hooters girls of the same episode name, I believe it was mildly surprising to see just how much the boys were getting uncomfortable by the Hooer party and all the Hooters running about. Maybe it was too much for them compared to what the Hooters girls have done in the past? I don't exactly know for sure, but again, it was a slight bit surprising. Sorry about that, hope I haven't rambled on too much, but I'm gonna go ahead and end it here because I believe I've said all that I need / want to. Again, one last thing, do not forget about that link down in the description below, or all the links rather. But anyways, thank you guys all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review as well as the reaction, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up guys, Otterpop here, and today I'm bringing you a new South Park review. Well, technically it's a review to reaction, which I posted a long time ago, but when you don't have a computer for almost 2 weeks, you fall behind on everything. I am glad I was able to publish the reactions on time, but yes, the review for this episode, as well as the next one, are going to be a little bit late, but I'm sure that a lot of you are okay with that because you got the reaction. Most of you don't watch the review, but I'm putting this review together anyways. So yes, sorry that this episode came a little bit late, but you can't really help it. Now before I start off with a quick recap of the episode, I want to briefly mention all the links in the description down below. So down there is going to be the link to the reaction, which again has been published for a while, but it's still going to be down there anyways because it'll be an official video on an official playlist, so it'll make it easier for me. Not to mention there's also a link to my Discord server, which I am semi-active. I've been trying to get a little more active, but it has been a little bit weird lately. And there's also a link to my Patreon, which I'm always accepting support for, and speaking of which, I have plenty of people to give a little bit of a shout out to because again, things have been weird with videos and I have yet to give an appropriate shout out, so here's my official shout out to a bunch of patrons that have pledged their support to me either previously or at some point this month. Big ol' fat shout out to Slackety and Popcorn73 who have pledged their support to me for quite some time now, and to recent patrons Adam Grunther, Joseph Bauer, Mike, and Sam DeRoy. Whether or not you guys are going to continue supporting me or whether you're just gonna, do it for a short period of time, the support is still always very much appreciated. I do like putting out all kinds of content out there, such as early access to videos and all different kinds of art and writing projects that I'm doing, as well as a whole bunch of other little stuff from time to time. So thank you guys so much for that support, and with that, let's go ahead and start off this review with a quick recap of the episode of Season 8, Episode 13, Cartman's Incredible Gift. An accident caused by his own doing leaves Cartman with a concussion, but the police mistakenly believe he is now a psychic, and so they request his help with catching a serial killer and quote-unquote copycat killers. Kyle tries using logic and evidence, but to no avail, so instead decides to have the same accident to prove Cartman a phony. Now let's just go ahead first and get the big reference out of the way. This episode was primarily a spoof for a movie/book called The Dead Zone, which was written by Stephen King in 1979. There are a whole bunch of other little references and parodies, but this was the major one. Basically, the story goes in The Dead Zone that a car accident victim awakens from a 5-year brain damage coma with the newfound ability to be clairvoyant and psychic, triggered by touch or something along those lines. And though he's initially hesitant, he helps law enforcement catch the local serial killer. I had never heard of this movie or this book before, but I'm also not terribly familiar with a lot of Stephen King's work. I'm familiar with some of the really well-known ones, like, It, Pet Sematary, and The Shining, but horror has also never really been my genre, so I've never really delved too much into any of his works or anything like that. I don't like reading that kind of stuff, I don't like writing that kind of stuff usually, and I don't like watching that kind of stuff, so that's my excuse. Of course, as I was watching this episode, it reminded me of a previous episode. I think it was called Biggest Douche in the Universe, but that episode was also an episode that mocked psychics, kind of like it does in this episode, but just not quite in the same way. Like, clearly, psychics were mocked again, but in just a very different way, and that's what I initially thought, but then I realized, after doing some research, that no, it's just basically a big ol' spoof of this other thing related to psychics, so again, still mocking, but just in a very different way. The general plot, I think, was the biggest reference, but I think a fun little nod during part of the episode was when Cartman awakens after like 2 days in the hospital after his whole accident, and he's got a beard on him, and I'm like, oh, so much time has passed, but then no, only 2 days have passed. It was literally just like a face warm or something like that, but I think that right there is a little nod and reference to the Dead Zone in particular, which I think was a little bit funny and clever now that I rewatch it. But yes, fun little nod and reference there. There is one other big thing that I want to mention, something that I've mentioned in 1 or 2 previous reviews already, was the production issues that occurred especially towards the later half of the Season 8 releases. Stone and Parker admitted in their commentary that they were practically catatonic by the time this episode came around, because they were working on Team America and that just took so much time out of them, and then they had to push out the rest half of Season 8 episodes, and they were just so burnt out. I mean, heck, by the time that Season 8 Episode 8 Quest for Ratings started, they were just practically dead. Which, funny enough, that Episode 8 kind of reflected their frustrations with the Season 8 and Team America schedule in general, which makes sense. They thought they did a good job with the previous episode, the Paris Hilton episode, but then once they started working on this episode, they felt like they'd lost some of their mojo. And again, this is what they were stating on in the commentary. But yeah, they were just wiped out, and they had to do this episode and another episode. They almost didn't even do the next episode. There are definitely a few other production-related notes that I could share, but I'll actually save those for the next review in particular, because I think that there's a little bit more to talk about in that aspect, because Stone and Parker were talking about the production a little bit more by the time they were doing some commentary on episode 14. Again, they did mention it from time to time for Season 8 for episodes 8 through 13, but there was especially a little bit more to talk about once episode 14 rolled around. But yeah, I think for now, all you need to know is that by the time that this episode came around, Stone and Parker were pretty pooped out. They were probably not having the time of their lives. Now, some of you may have noticed during my reaction, I went on a little bit of a forensic rant at some point during my reaction to this episode. Apparently I got a little bit intense, but that's kind of up for you to determine. But I definitely went on a little bit of a rant, and that kind of brings me a little bit into my next point, and that is my greater appreciation for the character that is Kyle. Now, that may sound a little bit confusing to some people, but I really did have a much greater appreciation for Kyle by the time that this episode ended. Throughout most of the episode, my appreciation and I guess approval of him just kind of grew and grew a little bit. Kyle did claim at one point during the episode that he knows that serial killers sometimes return to the scene of a crime, whether for satisfaction or regret or fear, whatever the reason. He mentioned this after saying that he, Stan, and Kenny saw this one guy at the last crime scene and deduced, oh, that guy could potentially be a serial killer since serial killers are known to return to the crime scene. Now, I will go ahead and state that a lot of people do view this as fact, and it's understandable why, but keep in mind that this is only partially true. Some serial killers and some criminals in general may return to the scene of a crime, but not a substantial enough portion that everybody should be led to believe that almost everybody, every kind of criminal and serial killer does it. Typically, this decision of whether or not they return to the scene of a crime often depends on how organized organized or disorganized they are, and their reasoning behind their crimes. So there, you learn something new. And funny enough, it was actually in that same scene where Kyle mentioned to the police officers at a different crime scene that he ran some fingerprints and did a blood sample analysis. And boy do I have questions. How could he have possibly done this, for one thing? Granted, it is relatively easy to document and scan fingerprints, but background checks and comparisons can take upwards of days. Laboratory blood analyses can take days as well, but the time can vary. And how did Kyle send in the prints and analyze the blood in a seemingly short period of time with no official access to any of the programs or tools or connections that most law enforcement do? Not to mention that there was something that I specifically mentioned in the reaction are the jurisdiction issues. Civilians can't perform these kinds of activities or run these kinds of tests, let alone tamper with potential crime scenes. But like I mentioned, I'm willing to let it slide since other than being a civilian, Kyle appeared to make the correct move forensic and investigation-wise in this particular episode. Again, as a civilian, he has no jurisdiction, no ability to be able to do this, but he did it. Oy vey. Varying issues aside, I at least was thankful that there was at least one character who was trying to seemingly solve the case, unlike the dumb arse policemen of South Park. Forensic rant over. Stan and Kenny technically did follow him, but Kyle was practically the most sane and logical one throughout the entirety of the episode, which is partially what raised my appreciation for him. I feel like I almost would have expected Stan to take up this kind of role, but given Kyle's feelings towards Cartman throughout the episode and what happened at the beginning of the episode and what's been happening in previous episodes, especially as it pertains to the relationship between Cartman and Kyle, it still made some sense, so I'm kind of willing to let that slide. Besides, it's South Park, it's episodic. I can't really question it too much, but here I am, still questioning it on occasion. There are also a couple of little miscellaneous things that I kind of wanted to mention first. Miss Crabtree, the bus lady, died? I guess so, but I really won't question it too much. It was kind of funny listening to the fourth wall being broken by one of the police officers when it stated that she was an ancillary character that fans wouldn't miss being gone. For those of you who aren't aware, ancillary characters are characters that appear from time to time as simply individuals that exist to add to or emphasize a story, which sounds about right for her character. I guess I can't say I'm terribly surprised that they probably kind of canonically killed off a character in the South Park universe. I mean, they already did that with Miss Fourth Grade. Kind of interesting how the only two characters who have really been killed off canonically throughout this entirety of the series were Miss Fourth Grade and Miss Crabtree, both more middle-aged women with weird physical or personality traits or I don't know. Maybe I'm just overthinking this. Alright. I'm about to show off a little bit of weeb right now, but at one point in the episode, Butters warned Kyle while the latter was trying to recreate Cartman's accident not to fly too close to the sun or his wings will be burned and make him crash into the ocean. I immediately thought that was funny, but not for the reasons people might think. Butters is basically referencing the Greek mythological story of Icarus and Daedalus. I know of the actual story in reference nowadays, but initially I recognized the story from the animes Full Metal Alchemist and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, as that particular story was also referenced in the very first few episodes of both anime. Like, those particular anime were the first instances that I heard that story, and then I ended up reading about it a little bit later at some point, and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting story. So as soon as Butters said that, my first thought immediately was Full Metal Alchemist. You know, at the time I was kind of thinking that Butters is actually a little smarter than I gave him credit for even knowing that story to begin with. I mean, he's still naive, but he's still relatively smart. By the way, if you ever want to watch anime and you can't think of anything to watch and you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Seriously, so good. I'm not sponsored or anything, but it's just something I really wanted to mention. Again, I know, total weeb. Kind of one more random little piece of information, but remember that slideshow that appeared later on in the episode where the serial killer ended up at various locations? Well, apparently that slideshow took a really long time to take. I mean, we're talking all kinds of like historic and geographical landmarks across the US that the South Park creators had to sort of animate, even if it was only brief stills. But man, some of the details on those things were actually pretty cool, especially since I've actually been to a few of those places. So yeah. I once again though do apologize a little bit for my long-winded forensic rant during my reaction. And again, I also apologize that this review came so late, but when you don't have a laptop for 2 weeks, you can't really do anything. But now I've got my computer back and everything is all good. But anywho, that is it for this particular video. Sorry it took so long, but now it is finally out, it is finally done, and hip hip hooray, this season will be done and over soon once I finish that last review. So thank you all for watching, I hope you guys enjoyed this little review, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters. What up? Guys, Otterpop here. This is it. This is the ending to Season 8. And oh my word, what a freaking ending. I don't know how many of you were looking forward to the review portion, but I'm sure a lot of you were probably looking forward to the reaction portion of this particular episode. I swear to goodness, how do I even start off a review of an episode like this? Oh wait, I know, by a quick reminder of all the links down the description below, including a link to the reaction, and yes, I know the review is coming much later than the reaction, but a lot of you are probably well aware at this point, if you're watching this shortly after it comes out, that I did not have my laptop for a while, so it's an excusable offense. There are also links to my Discord server as well as my Patreon, so do consider checking those out if you are interested. And I cannot believe I forgot this in the previous review. I'm just now realizing, like literally right now in this moment, the links to the profiles of the artists who've been helping me with the sprites and the backgrounds for these particular reviews and episodes also have shoutouts, and their profiles are linked down the description below. So many links. Anyways, this is the review for South Park Season 8, Episode 14, Woodland Critter Christmas. Yeah, okay, let's just start out with a recap. Stan helps out some overly happy woodland critters prepare for the holidays, only to learn he's actually been helping Satan-serving creatures who will do anything to bring the Antichrist into the world. You know, I do my absolute darndest not to try and cuss too much in these reviews, but after watching this episode, this is all I can say. What the hell? This is by far the weirdest, most disturbing, most WTF episode of South Park I have ever watched in my entire life. I mentioned this in my reaction as well, but long before I ever started watching or reacting to South Park in any fashion whatsoever, there were two episodes that I seen snippets of. One of them was Scott Tenorman Must Die. I'd mostly seen a couple of ending segments of that, and that was years ago. But the other episode that I saw snippets of was this. And when I say years ago, I mean my early to mid-teens, so I'm pretty sure I was about 13, 14, maybe 15, so 10 plus years ago basically. So my memory is a little bit hazy, but there were a couple of scenes or ideas of this episode that kind of stuck with me a little, or that I already knew about. The whole there being Satan worshipping critters and something about Stan being a central focus of that. But there were a lot of other aspects, like the mountain lion, the abortion clinic, the story, Santa, there was just a whole bunch that I was completely unaware of. Heck, I am certain that you could see it on my face as soon as I realized what episode this was. Even way back when, I knew that this was a pretty morbid or weird or fricked up episode in some fashion, and as I'm watching it initially, I'm just thinking to myself, is it really as bad as I thought it was? And by the end of it, I was thinking, it's just as bad as I thought it was, if not worse. One of the biggest twists was something that utterly shocked and confused and relieved yet also mortified me when I discovered that this was all just a convoluted story that Cartman came up with, on the fly or with a little planning. I don't know. I wasn't terribly shocked that of all characters, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it still did, that the creation of these creatures stemmed from Cartman's mind of all characters. These cutesy looking critters are about 5 times worse than Cartman could ever be. Not to mention, the kids of the class wanted to hear the end of Cartman's story? Is there something fundamentally wrong with them? I mean, these are South Park kids that we're talking about, so of course there is. And then there was the initial confusion to see Kyle so out of character, ridiculously out of character. But then once I realized it just stemmed from Cartman's imagination, I realized it made a lot more sense. Of course he would make an antagonist of the one kid he seemed to look down upon at all times. Again, I don't normally cuss, but fuck you, Cartman. Oh boy though, those Christmas critters. I'm not sure why, but those creatures were always disturbing to look at, even years ago when I saw snippets of this episode. If I had never seen or known of this episode prior to me watching this, and I was just blindly watching it everything for the first time, I might have had an uneasy feeling and gotten a serious shock factor from the later actions of those ridiculous creatures. This time though, because I knew a little bit ahead of time, just a smidge, it was only some prior knowledge, and it was overall a little bit more of being surprised that the critters were a lot worse than I remembered. There was still a little bit of a shock factor though, definitely. I did recognize it pretty readily. I didn't mention it because I was just mostly shocked about everything that was happening throughout the episode. The appearance of the critters references animal appearances from old animation and stop motion features like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman from decades ago, and I used to love some of those old movies as a kid, shockingly. So as soon as I saw the Christmas critters, I could see the resemblance, but again, I was more shocked at the story, so I just didn't say anything about it, because I just couldn't believe what the frick I was seeing. And that's not the only reference. The other reference that I learned a little bit about was a lot more disturbing in nature. The blood orgy from later in the episode references a 1997 film called Event Horizon, where an astronaut crew go on a rescue mission to the eponymous spaceship, the Event Horizon, that created a rift in time-space which allowed a supernatural entity to possess the ship, and there's a scene in that particular movie that shows the late crew of the Event Horizon engaging in behavior similar to what happened in the South Park episode with the sacrifice and the blood and... oh, of course there would be some event or reference like that South Park would reference at some point in their series. South Park, of all shows, would reference something like that, like what happened in that movie. There are no words. Whatever. Those Christmas critters are some demented effers, and I hope never to see them again. Ever. Okay, can I pretty please move on to a new topic now? I don't want to think about them anymore. I'm still relatively shocked, even weeks after I might have watched this episode. I'm still... I mentioned in a bunch of previous reviews, especially some of the later season 8 reviews, that there were so many production issues and a production nightmare in general for Stone Parker and the South Park team. Again, Stone and Parker were working on Team America around the same time that they were working on season 8, and so schedules got really crazy and all piled up and packed up, so. But for this episode in particular, it was pretty much laid out by Stone and Parker during their season 8 commentary. It was 1 week from ending a year of hell. It was a Thursday, and they needed to do one more episode, but they were so drained of energy and ideas. They couldn't even come up with anything by Friday. They were about to call Comedy Central and say they couldn't do it, until a little shred of an idea came near the end of the day on Friday. Woodland Critter Animal Christmas. Why? You know, initially, they had no plans of making another Christmas episode anytime soon, but by Saturday morning, the Critter Christmas idea was solidified, and by Saturday afternoon, they were talking about the animals needing Santa's help, and Satan, and blood orgies. And by Sunday, the idea was fully solidified as a story that Cartman is telling. Thank God, but I'm not sure if that makes it better or worse. I have no idea if the idea that Cartman came up with the story about the woodland critters is a relief or if it's a concern. I know kids can be a little bit crazy and sometimes even demented, but Cartman is even more so, and I've known this, but his individual self has to come up with an idea like the woodland critters that he talked about in his story, and the rest of the kids wanted to hear the story all the way through. What the hell? God, Cartman is so much worse than I ever thought he could be. He conceived that idea. Those critters were 5 times worse than he normally is, but they still stemmed from his imagination. I'll never be able to get over that. That's probably one of the biggest, craziest shock factors that I've experienced thus far. Sure, the story in general was a little bit of a shock factor and a little bit of a surprise and a little bit of a WTF. I had a WTF face for most of my reaction to that particular episode, but just the sheer fact that Cartman came up with that entire story idea. I don't even know what to do with that. Stone and Parker are given a lot of credit as being like mad geniuses and being able to put so much social and political and referential commentary within so many of their episodes. Most people probably realize, I usually don't, but I'm oblivious. But man, I don't think people fully realize how savage they can be sometimes. I mean, I know that they were having trouble coming up with ideas and they were so burnt out by this point, but how did that idea even get conceived and get greenlit by the whole team? I don't understand. I don't think I ever will. Even so, I can only imagine the joy between the entirety of the team once that episode was finalized and released. They must have been so happy to finish up that year. I can only imagine. Maybe I'll have to imagine it this way. When I finish out writing an entire novel draft, the relief that I feel, and I'm not even on a schedule, so it's probably 10 times more relieving than that feeling. Wow. Just wow. All that production craziness, and this is what they managed to pull out of their asses. Okay. That's all that I have to say for this particular episode and this particular video. Season 8 is done. It is finished. wow, I'm only really a third of the way through the entirety of South Park, so far at least, so far. It'll probably be a little bit before I resume Season 9. I'll probably be reacting to and reviewing the second season of Danverses, and I'll maybe start up Season 9 in the middle of those reactions. I'm not entirely sure yet, that's the idea that I'm going with, but we'll see what happens. But Season 8 is done, that's one season done, and geez, 16, 17, whatever to go. Oh boy. Not to mention there's the gameplays as well. That's not gonna happen for a while. On the bright side though, I'm about halfway to being able to play the first game, Stick of Truth. Hooray! But anyways, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna end it there. So yeah, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching me getting shocked and befuddled by everything that I was watching for that particular episode. You are welcome. And as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters.